Chapter 17. Fang Xinjian had not expected that his problem of not having enough money to eat would be solved so easily. He heaved a sigh of relief. He could now focus all his energy on sword arts training. As for helping Kyle manage the school, with his talent in sword arts, he was not afraid to waste that little bit of time. After all, the school of sword arts was in such dire straits that there was not much to do. Next, Fang Xinjian was called to one side of the training grounds by Kyle. Kyle looked at this disciple before him with a satisfied look on his face. To him, Fang Xinjian was not bad, be it in terms of talent or character. In comparison, although the silence of the other students was reasonable, it still made him feel a little bitterly disappointed. Xinjian, there aren't many people in the school now, and there isn't much to do. There aren't many things for you to do. Firstly, there's the problem of the food. However, Akeley's aunt has been a cook in the School of Sword Arts for over 20 years, so she won't make many mistakes. You just need to check on the food. Secondly, there's the daily cleaning and cleaning of the ground. There's also the tidying up and repairing of the props for practice. If anything breaks, you can go to the east of the city. I've also left the spare wooden swords. As for the cleaning of the toilets, you can let the students take turns to do it. As for the daily washing of the dishes, Akeley's aunt is getting on in years. If she's too busy, you can help her. Although Kyle said that there was not much to do, in the blink of an eye, more than an hour had passed. He smiled and said, I've also become more and more naggy. All right, I'll still go back to the school to sleep every night. If you have any problems, you can just ask me in the morning. Fang Xinjian nodded and said, Don't worry, teacher. I'll take care of everything. Kyle looked at Fang Xinjian. Seeing that he did not seem to have any intention of leaving, he asked, Is there anything else? Teacher. Fang Xinjian hesitated for a moment before asking, I'd like to learn another set of sword techniques from the School of Sword Arts. Kyle frowned and said, Learn another set? Xinjian, it's true that you have outstanding talent, but you mustn't bite off more than you can chew. There's a limit to a person's energy. You have great talent, but to be able to master the eagle sword technique, the grizzly bear sword technique, and the tenar-style body-strengthening sword technique to the maximum level within 2 to 3 years is already your limit. If you were to divert your energy into other sword techniques, it would instead slow down your progress. You must know that Ogden and the others have trained hard for almost 10 years, but they have only learned these 3 sets of sword technique. Fang Xinjian had already expected this. He took out the excuse he had prepared and explained, Teacher, I know. It's just that I've recently reached a bottleneck in the 3 sword techniques I've been cultivating. My proficiency is getting lower and lower, so I want to take a look at other sword techniques to comprehend by analogy and see if I can improve. What do you mean by analogy? Kerr laughed out loud and said, With your current weak sword arts, if you look at other sword arts that you have never learned before, it will only affect the sword arts that you have already learned. It might just make it harder for you to improve. Do you have any thoughts when you see Kaunitz? Kerr shook his head. Don't compare yourself to him. He's a true super genius, and he has been nurtured by the Treja clan since he was young. The food expenses that he has eaten since he was young are probably enough for you to eat for 10 lifetimes. Moreover, he has also mastered the Treja clan's sword techniques to the maximum level, and came to learn sword arts from me in order to pursue specializations. Specializations? Fang Xinjian said in surprise. A person's battle prowess is formed by attributes, techniques, and specializations. The reason why Kaunitz is learning new sword techniques is so that he can fulfill the requirement for the specialization sword specialist, and master 10 sword techniques to the maximum level. So that's how it is. A hint of understanding flashed in Fang Xinjian's eyes. At the same time, he knew that he would not be able to convince Kerr, so he did not insist on learning new sword technique. Instead, he nodded, and after receiving a few more pointers from Kerr, he returned to the training grounds. On the other side, Kyle waved at Ogden and called him over. Ogden, you have now mastered all 3 basic sword techniques to the maximum level, and the foundation for your muscles and bones is extremely firm. I will now impart to you the school of sword arts 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, and 9 Heavens Divine Sword. Ogden said agitatedly, 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, 9 Heavens Divine Sword. That's right. The Eagle Sword Technique, Grizzly Bear Sword Technique, and the 10R Style Body Strengthening Sword Technique are all basic techniques that train the muscles, bones, and vital energy. But the 9 Yang Divine Sword, 9 Yin Divine Sword, and 9 Heavens Divine Sword are different. They were brought over from the other side of the sea by a few unparalleled swordsmen from the Western land. Kerr said, these 3 sword techniques are nurturing techniques that nurture and strengthen the organs, as well as the human body's physique. Look at Kaunitz. His attributes have completely surpassed yours because he has mastered all of Treja clan's basic sword technique. Not only are his muscles and bones as firm as a rock, his internal organs are also condensed as one. His resistance to attacks, his ability to absorb nutrients, and his explosive power have all been greatly enhanced. Moreover, he has been eating and drinking well since he was young, and has been taking all sorts of secret medicine. This is why his attributes, such as strength, agility, endurance, and flexibility, are far superior to yours. A hint of understanding flashed in Ogden's eyes. So that's how it is. But thinking of how he was going to learn this sword technique soon, he could not help but feel excited. But you must know that out of the 3 sword techniques, I can only teach you the 9 Yang Divine Sword. If you wish to learn the 9 Yin Divine Sword or 9 Heavens Divine Sword, you will have to pass the test and join the School of Sword Arts Intersect. Most of the sects and academies in the world would only teach their disciples the ways to train their muscles and bones, which were also known as external martial arts. As for the nurturing of one's internal energy, or even the more profound and mysterious training techniques, the rules of the hare were all superficial. One had to pass the test and join the intersect before they could learn them. Only a direct descendant like Kaunitz would be able to learn Treja's sword techniques and participate in the country's selection. Kyle looked at Ogden and asked, now that all 3 of your basic sword techniques have reached the maximum level, according to the rules, I will have to ask you, do you wish to join the School of Sword Arts Intersect? Ogden fell silent for a moment, then said, Teacher, can we talk about this after I participate in the prefectural selection? Kyle said, what do you think? He shook his head, a hint of disappointment flashing in his eyes. Forget it, I won't force you. Just learn the sword. Remember, although the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique trains the internal organs, how can an ordinary person directly control the internal organs? That's why the movements of the sword technique are needed to guide the blood and internal organs to train from the inside out. The 9 Yang refers to the heart, liver, spleen, lungs, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and 2 kidneys. Using the 9 Yang sword technique, through the movements of the muscles and bones, to pressure and guide the blood and internal organs to move, massaging the internal organs. On the other side, Fang Xinjian had already been paying attention when Ogden had been called over. When he saw Kyle starting to demonstrate a set of unfamiliar sword techniques, he became even more focused. On the surface, he seemed to be demonstrating his sword techniques, but in reality 99% of his attention was focused on Kyle. 2 hours passed, and Kyle was no longer practicing his sword technique. Instead, he was watching Ogden practice the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique, occasionally pointing at Ogden's body and saying, No, no, the stance must be empty. When you attack, you must imagine yourself curled up into a ball, with all the energy gathered in your stomach. All right. That's all for now. I've taught you everything I can. The rest is up to you to comprehend. Ogden looked at Kyle, who was leaving in a hurry, and sighed. He knew that his recent 2 choices had disappointed his teacher. Moreover, his teacher was now preparing for the Sword Heroes battle, so how could he possibly focus on teaching him? However, he did not regret it. Joining the School of Sword Arts as an inner disciple would not change his fate. At most, he would be able to eat better and learn more sword technique. It was because he understood that with his talent, it was unlikely that he would be able to make a name for himself in the School of Sword Arts. In his lifetime, he would be satisfied to be able to reach Kyle's first transition level. Therefore, only by participating in the prefectural selection, becoming a knight and going through the first transition would he be able to change his fate, as well as the fate of his family. While Ogden was still cultivating with great difficulty, unable to comprehend the 9-yang divine sword technique, Fang Xinjian had already reached the first level of the 9-yang divine sword technique. Even though he could not hear Kyle's explanations, just by looking at his movements, he had already grasped the profoundness of it with his unparalleled talent. Holding back the joy in his heart, Fang Xinjian looked at the first level of the 9-yang divine sword technique and had no choice but to stop himself from practicing. Chapter 18. Over the next few days, Fang Xinjian practiced the School of Sword Arts basic sword techniques in the day, and at night, he secretly practiced the 9-yang divine sword technique. The difficulty of cultivating this divine sword technique was much higher than the grizzly bear sword technique, and Fang Xinjian's learning speed was also slower. During this period of time, Kaunitz had once again become the center of attention in the training ground. This young genius from the Treja clan seemed to be the center of attention no matter where he went. Even when he was practicing the eagle sword technique alone, there would always be a group of boys and girls following behind him to practice. It was as if they would be able to improve faster by following him. And every time Kaunitz stopped to rest or think, there would always be people offering him snacks or water to get close to him. "Young Master Kaunitz, would you like some water? Young Master Kaunitz, you're learning really fast. This eagle sword technique is already at level 2, right?" As expected of the genius from the Treja clan. However, in the face of such flattery, Kaunitz could not even be bothered to smile. He maintained a cold expression as he looked at the other acolytes, focusing all his attention on the sword technique. Only his slightly furrowed brows showed his impatience. All right. Don't disturb Kaunitz. The prefectural selection will depend on himself, and the same goes for martial arts training. Just then, Ogden walked up and, as usual, sent everyone away. Kaunitz nodded and said in a commanding tone, "You've come at the right time. Show me the 12th and 33rd moves of the grizzly bear sword technique." Ogden, on the other hand, started to show Kaunitz his sword technique with a cheerful expression. In fact, ever since Kaunitz had arrived, he no longer practiced with Fang Xinjian. Instead, he stayed by Kaunitz's side, practicing sword techniques with him every day, unreservedly contributing his experience in the eagle sword technique and grizzly bear sword technique. This is the successor of the Treja clan. As long as I can build a good relationship with him, the examiners in the prefectural selection will surely look up to me. Even if I don't pass the prefectural selection, I'll be able to get a job in the Treja clan. No, it'll be even better if I can enter the Treja Knight Academy. Ogden thought with the craftiness of a commoner. The wooden sword in his hand swung even harder in the next moment. Fang Xinjian did not think much of Ogden's flattery. This was reality, this was society. It was only right and proper for a subordinate to try his best to please a superior. If he did not have his extraordinary talent in swordsmanship, he might have made the same choice as Ogden. However, he had originally thought that Ogden was a simple and honest fellow. Now, it seemed that Ogden only looked simple and honest on the surface. In fact, he was just a cunning commoner with his own schemes. "Why is eldest senior brother like this?" Vivian bit her lip and said, "He used to practice swordsmanship with us. He usually looks so honest. This is too. What does this have to do with you?" Fang Xinjian continued to practice the grizzly bear sword technique, planning to bring it to the maximum level. The path is chosen by oneself. Even if the academy and the prefectural selection are useful, when it comes to martial arts, one can only rely on oneself. Attributes, techniques, specialties. These are all true. Vivian turned to look at Fang Xinjian, gradually calming herself down and focusing on practicing her swordsmanship. Over the past few days, Fang Xinjian had been making the best use of his time during the day to practice the grizzly bear sword technique. His grizzly bear sword technique was now at level 29, just a little bit away from reaching level 30. The wooden sword in his hand danced rapidly, its afterimages seeming to connect together. With each slash, the sword trembled and tore through the air, producing a sound similar to a grizzly bear's roar. With a loud boom, it was as if gunpowder had been ignited in the air. To Fang Xinjian, his mind was in a state of shock, as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning in a clear sky, causing him to see stars. He was stunned, feeling his entire body go numb, as if he had been electrocuted. His muscles and bones trembled thrice before he regained his senses. Level 30 Grizzly Bear Sword Technique. Strength +6, Agility +6. Increases the toughness of bones, strengthens the strength of internal organs, and significantly increases the recovery speed of muscles and bones from fatigue, greatly increasing the potential of the body. Fang Xinjian felt as if he was soaking in a hot spring at all times. His bones, muscles were trembling slightly, continuously massaging and maintaining his body. All the excess and burdensome parts were shaken off and then cleaned up. The level 30 Grizzly Bear Sword Technique was maintaining his body at all times, helping him to increase his body's potential and strengthening his foundation. Now, his attributes had become: Name: Fang Xinjian. Age: 16. Occupation: Warrior's Squire. Level: 9. Strength: 20. Agility: 24. Reaction: 11. Endurance: 8. Flexibility: 12. His strength and agility were no longer inferior to Ogden or Lambert, who had been training at the School of Sword Arts since young. In fact, they were even slightly better. Fang Xinjian's mind was in a state of joy. Just then, a commotion came from the other side of the training grounds. He's lost, Lambert has also lost. To think that eldest martial brother Ogden and second martial brother Lambert have both lost. This is Treja's super genius. Kaunitz is too amazing. How long has he been training in the grizzly bear sword technique? We'll never be able to match up to his talent in our entire lives. Kaunitz looked at Lambert, who was lying on the ground, and shook his head, saying, "Your attributes are too weak. There's no way you can unleash the profoundness of the grizzly bear sword technique. There's really no point in sparring with you." Ogden smiled at the side, as if he was not bothered by his earlier failure. He looked at the pale-faced Lambert and said, "After all, we're all people with mediocre talent. Naturally, we can't compare to a genius like young Master Kaunitz. One day of your training is equivalent to several years of our training." Lambert's chest heaved a few times, as if he wanted to say something harsh, but he did not manage to do so. In the end, his face turned red with anger, and he ran out of the door with his sword in hand. It was obvious that he did not have the face to stay here any longer. Kaunitz shook his head once again. Practicing swordsmanship requires one to be courageous and diligent, to be unyielding. If one can't even take this little bit of humiliation, what's the point of learning swordsmanship? With that, he turned his head and looked in the direction of Fang Xinjian, asking, "I heard that there's another genius in the School of Sword Arts who managed to learn the grizzly bear sword technique on the first day." Ogden nodded and said, "That's right. Teacher said that Xinjian's foundation is extremely solid, and that before he entered the school, he had already learned a set of basic sword techniques to the maximum level. That's why he was able to pick up the grizzly bear sword technique so easily." "Good foundation?" Kaunitz walked up to Fang Xinjian and said, I need someone to spar with me in the grizzly bear sword technique. I want you to try dissecting the sword moves. His tone sounded as if it was only natural, and even as if he was giving alms. Not interested. Fang Xinjian did not even turn his head and continued practicing the eagle sword technique. After reaching level 30, his grizzly bear sword technique had also reached the maximum level. His next goal was to master the eagle sword technique to the maximum level. He had no interest in sparring with Fang Xinjian or feeding him moves. Chapter 19. Kaunitz furrowed his brows, as if he had not expected that a dirty-looking commoner would reject him. He could not be bothered to say another word. The wooden sword in his hand trembled, and with a vigorous force, it slammed forward like a bear's claw. Fang Xinjian's brows furrowed, and with a turn of his body, he blocked the other party's blade with his sword. He felt a tremor coming from the other party's sword, and the tremendous force was like an elephant ramming into him. It almost knocked the longsword out of his hand, and he could not help but retreat 3 steps before he was able to dissipate the force. With this collision, Fang Xinjian understood that his opponent had more or less comprehended the essence of the grizzly bear sword technique. He was indeed a rumored genius. In fact, Kaunitz's strength and agility were both over 30 points, completely above Fang Xinjian's. If not for the fact that his grizzly bear sword technique's level was lower than Fang Xinjian's, he would have been able to defeat Fang Xinjian with this attack. Kaunitz did not stop after forcing his opponent back with a single strike. Instead, he took a step forward, and like a grizzly bear that had suddenly exerted its strength, the long sword in his hand pressed down with a vigorous aura. The blade of the sword tore through the air, emitting the sound of wind and thunder, and smashed down like a huge hammer. Kaunitz used the grizzly bear sword technique's method of exerting force in his 2 consecutive attacks. Unlike ordinary sword techniques, which focused on agility, it was as if a grizzly bear was recklessly displaying its brute force. After being continuously attacked by Kaunitz, Fang Xinjian had gone through a huge change and was no longer a kind person. With a flick of the sword in his hand, tens of black shadows pierced forward. With the level 30 grizzly bear sword technique being displayed, it was as if a huge, violent bear had been awakened from hibernation, opening its huge, bloody maws and biting wildly towards Kaunitz. This was no longer a nurturing technique used to train one's body, but a killing technique born to kill. Bang 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 bang! Their swords clashed continuously, and a series of clashing sounds rang out. It was as if a bomb had been ignited in the air. Kaunitz clearly felt that his strength and speed were above his opponent's, but every time he stabbed out with his sword, his opponent was able to instantly see through his subsequent changes. Kaunitz's attacks were all aimed at his flaws, making it difficult for him to exert his strength. The next moment, his opponent's sword shadows changed once again, and his moves became even more ferocious. More often than not, just as he was about to unleash a move, his opponent would have already countered it. This meant that his opponent's understanding of the grizzly bear sword technique's variations far surpassed his own. On the other side, Fang Xinjian felt that everything was extremely easy. His opponent's speed was only slightly higher than his, but just by looking at the movements of his opponent's shoulders, elbows, and fingers, he could already tell which move his opponent was going to make. He was too familiar with the grizzly bear sword technique, and was able to easily break his opponent's attack, and even counterattack with ferocious speed. And every time their swords collided, he could feel the change in his opponent's force. This was probably the reason why Kaunitz wanted to have a duel. He wanted to learn how to exert force by feeling the other party's force. Fang Xinjian also felt that in just a few moves, Kaunitz had already improved. He was indeed worthy of being called a genius in swordsmanship. With a crisp tearing sound, the long sword in Fang Xinjian's hand was like a rampaging tank. After breaking through Kaunitz's sword technique, Fang Xinjian slapped away Kaunitz's longsword with a smack, thrusting toward Kaunitz's chest. "I've won," Just as Fang Xinjian was thinking about this, a hint of fury flashed in Kaunitz's eyes. He flicked his fingers continuously, and it was as if every muscle in his body was emitting the sound of metal colliding. His palm, which had lost all of its strength, once again tightened its grip on the sword hilt. With an explosive clang, Fang Xinjian's attack was blocked by Kaunitz's horizontal slash this time around. Following that, sounds of bones and tendons popping rang out from his opponent's body, and his muscles swelled up as if they had been inflated. The sword in his hand once again slashed out towards Fang Xinjian, ignoring everything else. With this slash, Kaunitz's entire body seemed to have turned into a towering mountain, and the long sword in his hand also seemed to have the strength of a mountain. Fang Xinjian used the stance of the grizzly bear sword technique to receive the attack, but he discovered that his opponent's strength was vigorous and condensed, as if a mountain was pressing down on him. With a stifled grunt, he quickly retreated. It was obvious that Kaunitz was unwilling to be defeated, and had directly switched to the sword technique he was most proficient in. The sword technique he was performing now was Treasure Knight Academy's nurturing technique, Chaotic Strike. This set of sword technique emphasized on training the strength and explosive power of one's muscles and bones. Kaunitz had long since trained the Chaotic Strike to the maximum level of level 12. Now that he was performing it, it was like a titan lifting up a mountain and smashing it down continuously. Kaunitz had always been proud of being able to train this set of sword technique to the level of excellence at level 12. On the other side, Fang Xinjian could not see any openings, and was completely suppressed by his opponent's superior speed and strength. Bang 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 bang. After receiving 5 to 6 attacks consecutively, Fang Xinjian felt his vital energy and blood churning, and his arms turning numb. It was as if his longsword would fall out of his hands at any moment. This time around, Kaunitz's attributes were completely unleashed, and he was no longer suppressed like when he had been using the grizzly bear sword technique. In an instant, Fang Xinjian felt an immense pressure. This guy. His strength, agility, and flexibility are all at least 30 and above. Fang Xinjian felt as if he had been blasted by a cannon with every sword attack he received. Relying on the unfamiliar sword technique and the complete suppression of his attributes, Fang Xinjian was completely suppressed by Kaunitz in an instant. This was what it meant to suppress someone with strength. Another 3 consecutive heavy blows, each sword heavier than the one before, not giving Fang Xinjian any chance to retaliate. Finally, with a loud crack, the last blow broke the wooden sword in Fang Xinjian's hand into 2, dropping it onto the ground. Ogden immediately walked up and said, "What a powerful sword technique. Young Master Kaunitz, was that the sword technique that was passed down in Treja's lineage? It feels much more powerful than our grizzly bear sword technique. This sword technique's aura is powerful and heavy. It feels like the explosive power is even above that of the grizzly bear sword technique." The surrounding apprentices all came up to fawn over him, but Kaunitz's face was filled with displeasure. He had lost in the duel of the grizzly bear sword technique and was forced to use the sword technique he had originally learned. To a genius like him, this was equivalent to losing. With a cold snort, he turned to leave, intending to train for a few more days and level up the grizzly bear sword technique before coming back to spar with Fang Xinjian. Vivian ran to Fang Xinjian's side and asked anxiously, "Senior Xinjian, are you all right?" Fang Xinjian rubbed his slightly numb wrist and did not reply. His attention had already been attracted by the skills window. He did not know when another skill had appeared on it. Chaotic Strike, 5%. Chaotic Strike? Could this be the sword technique that Kaunitz had just used? A look of astonishment flashed in Fang Xinjian's eyes. To think that my talent has reached such a level that I can learn my opponent's sword technique just by sparring with him? Fang Xinjian, who had been a little depressed at not being able to learn the other sword techniques from the School of Sword Arts, was now completely excited. He did not even care about the fact that he had been defeated by Countet. He casually took Vivian's longsword and called out to Countet's, who had turned to leave, "Hey, let's have another round." Countet's turned his head and looked at Fang Xinjian expressionlessly. In fact, he could also feel that Fang Xinjian's grizzly bear sword technique was much more exquisite than Ogden's. If he could spar with Fang Xinjian, his grizzly bear sword technique would improve even faster. He had been born with an innate specialty called force sensing. Such a situation where one was born with an innate specialty was called an innate specialty, and it was also a sign of a genius. Countet's force sensing could sense the changes in his opponent's force more clearly than ordinary people. Therefore, when he practiced his sword techniques, he liked to spar with experts in the same field. This way, he could increase his proficiency very quickly. However, he would not be able to defeat Fang Xinjian with just the grizzly bear sword technique, and he hated people who refused to admit defeat when they failed. This was why he had thought of challenging Fang Xinjian in a few days' time. Seeing that Fang Xinjian still dared to challenge him, Fang Xinjian's lips curled into a cold smile, saying, "Since you're looking for a beating, I'll naturally accompany you to the end." Chapter 20. With that, the two of them once again engaged in battle. At the start, they were still using the grizzly bear sword technique to attack and defend against each other. However, even though his attributes were suppressed, Fang Xinjian, who possessed the level 30 grizzly bear sword technique, was still able to defeat Countet's very quickly, forcing him to give up on using the grizzly bear sword technique and switch to another set of sword technique. However, this set of sword technique was completely different from the chaotic strike that he had used earlier. The moment he performed it, Countet's right hand turned into a series of illusions, and the muscles in his hand trembled at an unbelievable speed. Along with a myriad of sword light, it pierced out toward Fang Xinjian like mercury flowing through the ground. It was like sunlight, pervasive and omnipresent. Fang Xinjian let out a dull grunt as he rolled out of the sword circle. His shirt was almost torn to shreds, and his entire body was covered in wounds, looking extremely pathetic. The grizzly bear sword technique was, after all, a basic sword technique. It was used to train and cultivate the physical body, and its battle prowess was not strong. He's really overestimating himself. Who does he think he is? He even dares to challenge Countet. There's no other way. The difference is too great. Once Countet doesn't use the grizzly bear sword technique, Fang Xinjian is no match for him. After defeating his opponent once again, Countet looked at Fang Xinjian with an amused gaze and asked, "Why, do you still want to fight?" Fang Xinjian looked at the new Silver Moon Prayer sword technique, 6%, that had appeared on his stats window, and the battle intent in his eyes surged. Just like that, Fang Xinjian charged forward again and again, using the grizzly bear sword technique to suppress his opponent, only to be defeated again and again by Treasure Academy's sword technique. His entire body was covered in dust and bloodstains. When the students at the side saw his pathetic state, their eyes were filled with mockery and mockery. Is this guy an idiot? He's really overestimating himself. Does he think he can win just like that? Ogden could not bear to watch any longer and said, "What a pointless persistence. Enough is enough, Fang Xinjian. Don't embarrass the School of Sword Arts." Vivian's expression was also a little ugly. She didn't expect the gap between Fang Xinjian and Countet's to be so big. She looked at Fang Xinjian, who was fighting, and then looked at Countet. No one knew what she was thinking. "Shut up," Countet shouted softly, and quickly suppressed all the voices around him. "Can't you see that I'm practicing with Fang Xinjian?" Countet looked at Fang Xinjian and thought to himself, "This guy has been able to last longer after I changed my sword technique. He really has talent." And indeed, sparring with him with the grizzly bear sword technique has allowed my proficiency level to rise very quickly. The corners of his mouth curled up as he said, "Do you want to continue?" Fang Xinjian did not say a word. He only drew his sword once again and dashed towards Kaunitz with the grizzly bear sword technique. Looking at the repeated battles in the training field, most of the apprentices had expressions of mockery, contempt, and pity for each other. A few minutes later, most of them stopped watching and started to practice their swordsmanship. Vivian, Ogden, and the others took a few more glances, complicated expressions flashing in their eyes. They also went to the side to practice their sword technique. Become stronger, I must become stronger. Otherwise, there will come a day when I'll end up like Fang Xinjian, being trampled on by others. This is definitely not the future I want. This was what most of the students were thinking. Therefore, they put in even more effort in their sword practice, putting in more effort than ever before, just to prepare for the upcoming prefectural selection. At most, they would take a few more glances at the battle between Kaunitz and Fang Xinjian in their free time. Looking at the figure covered in injuries, it was as if they were looking at a clown. Fang Xinjian did not care about all this. He only had 5 years, and he wanted to use all means possible to obtain power within these 5 years. Not only did he want to pass the Empire selection, but he also wanted to pursue the best results. For example, in this selection, his first goal was to become the prefectural champion, which was also the prefectural champion. In the Empire, the prefectural champion would be known as the prefectural champion, followed by the regional champion, and finally, the national champion. In the history of the Empire, it had been 200 years since there had been an extremely strong person who had won 3 consecutive championships. Failure after failure, but challenge after challenge. Within 1.5 hours, he and Kaunitz had already battled tens of times. But so what? Being looked down on by some students, being suppressed by a 16-year-old young man, and some superficial injuries were nothing compared to that night's conversation and the 7 days of torture. They could not even leave a trace in Fang Xinjian's mind. After consecutive battles, even with Kaunitz's stamina, he could not help but start panting. Fang Xinjian was so tired that he half knelt on the ground, not moving at all. Compared to his usual training, this kind of battle required him to unleash all his energy instantaneously, and the consumption of energy was much higher than when he had been training. However, all of Fang Xinjian's efforts had come at a price. He looked at his stats window, which had changed to Chaotic Strike, 42%, Silver Moon Prayer Sword Technique, 32%, Descent of Holy Light, 30%, and Treja Style Foundation Sword Technique, 12%. He could not help but feel excited. He exhaled, looked at Kaunitz and said, "Let's stop here for today. We'll continue tomorrow." Humph. Kaunitz let out a cold snort, then turned around to continue practicing the grizzly bear sword technique. After a while, Fang Xinjian, who had rested, also started practicing the eagle sword technique. In the next few days, Fang Xinjian became busier and busier. In the morning and at night, he had to help out with matters of the School of Sword Arts, and every day, he had to focus on practicing the eagle sword technique. Other than that, he also had to spar with Kaunitz. While he was defeated time and time again, he had to secretly learn Kaunitz's sword technique from Treja. Moreover, Fang Xinjian discovered that as the percentage of techniques he was secretly learning increased, the speed at which he was secretly learning became slower and slower. Actually, it was easy to understand that although he had high talent, he was still limited by his own standards, and had yet to reach the point where he could make up for his lack of sword technique. Initially, he had not seen the chaotic strike at all, so he would naturally learn it as he saw it. However, as he learned more and more sword techniques, the number of sword techniques he had not learned decreased. As long as Kaunitz did not perform the sword techniques he had not learned before, the speed at which he was secretly learning would not increase. However, as the days passed and soon, half a month had gone by, his eagle sword technique had improved tremendously. After breaking through to level 30, it provided him with A+3 in agility, +3 in reaction, +3 in endurance, and +3 in flexibility. This caused his attributes to become 20 points in strength, 27 points in agility, 14 points in reaction, 11 points in endurance, and 15 points in flexibility. This increase brought his attributes closer to Kaunitz's 30 points in strength and agility. Moreover, he was getting more and more familiar with Kaunitz's sword techniques, allowing him to last longer and longer. This left Kaunitz with no choice but to perform new sword techniques, allowing Fang Xinjian to constantly learn new sword technique. However, even if Fang Xinjian wanted to defeat Kaunitz, he was still a distance away. Just the difference in attributes alone was hard to make up for. Of course, if he had used the level 30 Grizzly Bear sword technique right from the start, Fang Xinjian would have been able to instantly defeat Kaunitz's low-level Grizzly Bear sword technique. However, since he was secretly learning Kaunitz's sword techniques, he would naturally not do such a thing. Instead, he wanted to give Kaunitz enough time to switch his sword techniques and unleash his true abilities. These few sword techniques that Kaunitz is displaying are all at the same level as the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique. They seem to be using the power of his internal organs, and in addition to the fact that his attributes are higher than mine to begin with, he is able to suppress me in all aspects once he displays his own sword technique. Kaunitz's 10 years of sword training, the Trija clan's sword techniques that had been passed down for hundreds of years, as well as the endless amounts of secret medicine, tonics, and medicinal cuisine, were all not for nothing. The amount of time I've spent training is still too short. It was a pity that the difficulty of the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique was much higher than other sword technique. During this period of time, Fang Xinjian had only reached level 8. He could indeed feel that his internal organs had been tempered a step further, but he was still unable to increase his attributes. Of course, Kaunitz had only thought that Fang Xinjian had outstanding talent and could quickly adapt to his sword technique. He had not expected that Fang Xinjian would be able to grasp the way he circulated his energy and learn the entire sword technique just by observing and interacting with him. However, he felt that it would take longer and longer for him to defeat Kaunitz. Many times, he would have to display new sword techniques in order to do so. After all, even with his speciality, force sensing, he could only truly learn the other party's sword techniques after knowing the profoundness of the sword technique in advance. However, as Fang Xinjian was defeated time and time again, his popularity in the school of sword arts declined rapidly. Almost no one dared to practice with him anymore. Everyone avoided him like the plague. Even though he had improved significantly, and was even able to hold his own for a period of time against Kaunitz, who was going all out, it was still the same. In their eyes, Fang Xinjian had already become Kaunitz's punching bag every day. Who would dare to get close to him? Were they not afraid of the Trija clan's power? Under the pressure of the Trija clan, the talent that Fang Xinjian had displayed seemed to pale in comparison to the Trija clan's pressure. Therefore, one day when Fang Xinjian walked to the training grounds, he saw the looks of disgust, contempt, and mockery from the people around him. Seeing how the people around him had retreated, he did not show any reaction. He only minded his own business and started practicing the tenar-style body-strengthening sword technique. What he wanted to do next was to bring this sword technique to the maximum level. The people around him took a few glances at him, but did not pay any more attention to him. Time had passed too quickly, and there were only 4 months left until the prefectural selection. The surrounding students put even more effort into practicing their sword techniques, hoping to achieve a breakthrough before the prefectural selection began. Lambert glanced at Fang Xinjian, who was silently practicing his sword technique. Ever since the day he had been defeated and humiliated by Kaunitz, he had kept a low profile. Looking at Fang Xinjian, he nodded to himself. Don't fall down. The trash around you are all blind. To be able to withstand Kaunitz's pressure and still improve at a rapid pace every day. You're the real genius. The The training grounds were silent, with only the swishing sounds of sword techniques being heard. Chapter 21. At the break of dawn the next day, the training grounds of the School of Sword Arts were filled with the silhouettes of youths training. Ogden was still painstakingly trying to comprehend the secrets of the 9-yang divine sword technique. Lambert continued to practice the eagle sword technique, hoping to master this last basic sword technique to the maximum level before the prefectural selection. Fang Xinjian had just finished some of the chores in the school and started to practice the tenar-style body-strengthening sword technique. This sword technique, which was compulsory for the Empire's military, was concise and profound, especially when it came to the training of the joints and ligaments. It could greatly increase the speed of his sword move. No one spoke and no one rested. Only puffs of hot white steam could be seen rising from the students' bodies in the cold weather. Perhaps they were burdened with hatred or with their dreams, or with the responsibilities of their entire families. Everyone was constantly advancing towards their own goals. Suddenly, the School of Sword Arts' main door was pushed open, and Kaunitz and Vivian walked in together. Seeing the two of them chatting and laughing, Ogden's eyes widened, as if he could not believe that this was the same Kaunitz who always spoke sarcastically and looked down on everyone. Vivian had changed into a light blue dress, which matched well with her youthful and beautiful face. She looked like a beautiful young lady, and was even more beautiful than usual. Lambert laughed coldly, looking at Vivian with an even more disdainful gaze. As for Fang Xinjian, he did not feel anything about Vivian's actions of getting closer to Kaunitz and giving him the cold shoulder these few days. He did not know if he was being too rational, or if the purple flames had robbed him of love, friendship, and kinship. In any case, he had given her pointers and repaid her for that meal. Whatever path she chose in the future had nothing to do with him. However, seeing that Kaunitz had arrived, he could not wait any longer and struck out with his sword. "Let's begin." Kaunitz smiled arrogantly. "Haven't you been beaten up enough?" The next moment, the two of them crossed paths like lightning, and then collided once again. It was still a familiar rhythm. However, during this period of training, Kaunitz's grizzly bear sword technique had also improved a lot, reaching level 2. He was now able to withstand a few more blows from Fang Xinjian. However, the moment he showed signs of being defeated, he immediately displayed his own sword technique in an attempt to turn the situation around. A series of sword moves of descending holy light descended from the sky like divine light from beyond the heavens. Kaunitz used the strength of his back, spine, and shoulder blades. It was as if he had grown a pair of wings on his back. With every contraction of his back and his heart and lungs, Kaunitz continued to fly around, surrounding Fang Xinjian in the middle. Fang Xinjian could only parry Kaunitz's attacks, unable to retaliate at all. This set of descent of holy light was specially used by Tresia Knight Academy to train one's back and legs in exerting force, increasing the practitioner's movement speed. When Kaunitz executed it, he seemed to leave behind a series of afterimages, causing the surrounding crowd to cheer incessantly. The 4 sets of sword techniques that Kaunitz had used to defeat Fang Xinjian during this period of time were all at the same level as the 9-yang divine sword technique. They were powerful sword techniques that combined internal and external forces and stimulated the strength of one's internal organs. Coupled with his attributes that were already stronger than Fang Xinjian's, he was able to suppress Kaunitz in all aspects. Looking at Fang Xinjian, who had his sword knocked out of his hand due to his clumsiness, Vivian frowned and wanted to persuade Kaunitz to show mercy. However, thinking of how he had taken a liking to her earlier, she decided to swallow her anger. She only looked at Fang Xinjian with a hint of pity in her gaze. She had originally thought that Fang Xinjian was already a genius in swordsmanship, a man with a bright future ahead of him. However, when Fang Xinjian stood next to Kaunitz, he immediately paled in comparison. Kaunitz's appearance, talent, bloodline, clan, and background were all far superior to Fang Xinjian's. Fang Xinjian's so-called talent suddenly became so insignificant in front of Kaunitz. This was especially so in the past 10 or so days, when Fang Xinjian had challenged Kaunitz time and time again. He had not been able to defeat Kaunitz even once. This made her even more disappointed in Fang Xinjian. And after chatting with Kaunitz, she realized that her horizons had been too narrow. The entire empire, the entire world, had always had a wider sky. There were all sorts of outstanding people, clans and factions that had been passed down for hundreds or even thousands of years. They were far from what she could imagine in the school of sword art. On the other side, Fang Xinjian picked up the longsword in his hand and looked at the progress of the descent of holy light, which had once again increased. He smiled in satisfaction, took a deep breath, and said, again. However, Kaunitz did not continue the battle. Instead, he threw a glance at the people in the training grounds, who were either secretly peeking at him or laughing coldly in low voices. Although most of them were targeting Fang Xinjian, for some reason he felt displeased. Kaunitz suddenly said, "A bunch of buzzing flies." He looked at Fang Xinjian and said, "Let's go to the small forest at the back to train." The backyard of the School of Sword Arts was a small forest. Usually, there were some students who wanted a quiet place to train there. Naturally, Fang Xinjian did not mind. He nodded and headed to the small forest with Kaunitz. Vivian wanted to go with them but was stopped by Kaunitz. "I want a quiet environment to train, so that I can focus." Therefore, the two of them went to the small forest and engaged in a series of battles. Without anyone spying on them, Kaunitz was able to unleash his powers freely. With a few whistles, the long sword in his hand moved faster and faster. Sometimes, even when he was about to lose, he would not switch to using his school's sword techniques, but would instead focus on displaying the grizzly bear sword technique. After being almost defeated by Fang Xinjian's grizzly bear sword technique a few times, he laughed out loud and became even more excited. He felt that his grizzly bear sword technique was improving at a faster rate. However, Fang Xinjian was not there to help Fang Xinjian practice his sword. Seeing that Fang Xinjian was starting to not care about winning or losing when no one was paying attention to him, and was showing signs of not using his school's sword techniques, Fang Xinjian could not help but infuriate him. Fang Xinjian sent Fang Xinjian's longsword flying with 3 consecutive strikes, and then placed his sword on Kaunitz's neck. He laughed and said, "Sissy, if not for the fact that you were born better, how could you be my match? You're just a so-called genius who relied on the resources of the Treja clan." A hint of anger flashed in Kaunitz's eyes. "You're asking for a beating." With a flash of lightning, Kaunitz kicked up the longsword on the ground and held it in his hand. A series of chaotic shock attacks pressured Fang Xinjian so much that he could not breathe. "That's it!" Fang Xinjian bellowed furiously in his heart, displaying the full power of the level 30 grizzly bear sword technique. He was like a raging grizzly bear, each sword strike carrying a force that could send a strong man flying over 10 meters away, clashing with Kaunitz. As Fang Xinjian's sword techniques improved and his physical strength increased, the time they spent sparring every day slowly increased from 2 hours to 3 hours, 4 hours, and even 5 hours. The days passed just like that. In the training grounds, there were people who could not bear the loneliness and went to bed early, while there were people who gave up early because they did not have much time left. There were also people who endured the loneliness and boredom, becoming stronger and stronger as they trained day after day. Chapter 22. After a month, Fang Xinjian's 10R-style body strengthening sword technique had already reached the maximum level of level 30, and his 9-yang divine sword technique had also reached the maximum level of level 20. His endurance attribute had also increased by 1 point during the crazy battles every day. After all, his endurance was weak to begin with, so he was able to increase it much faster than others. The level 30 10R style body strengthening sword technique had increased his agility by 1 point, reaction by 4 points, flexibility by 4 points, and he was able to perform various extreme movements like a gymnast. Furthermore, due to the great increase in flexibility, he made fewer mistakes in his movements, and the stability and accuracy of his exertion had also greatly increased. As for the level 29 Yang Divine Sword technique, it had increased his strength by 5 points, agility by 5 points, endurance by 4 points, and flexibility by 4 points. Furthermore, due to the refinement of his internal organs, his explosive power and stamina had greatly increased. His immunity, physique, and resistance to attacks had also greatly improved. As a result, his current attributes had become: name, Fang Xinjian, age, 16, occupation, warrior's squire level, 9 strength, 25 agility, 33 reaction, 18 endurance, 16 flexibility, 23. Now, he would not feel tired even if he were to battle for 5 hours. With a punch, he could blast a hole in a wall, and for a short period of time, he could be compared to a car. He was practically a human-shaped tank. Although the current Fang Xinjian was weaker than Kaunitz in terms of strength, his speed was already a notch higher. Coupled with the level 30 Grizzly Bear Sword technique, he could sometimes capitalize on some of Kaunitz's mistakes and defeat him, even if Kaunitz used a high-level sword technique. After all, there was only a slight difference between the two of them. Even if the odds of victory were 70 to 30%, if they were to really fight, there should be a winner and a loser, and not as one-sided as it was now. However, in order to obtain Treasure Academy's sword techniques from Kaunitz every day, Fang Xinjian had been controlling the rhythm of the battle. He did not defeat Kaunitz immediately, but instead blocked his opponent's sword moves every time, until Kaunitz used a new sword move. Only then would he pretend to be defeated. With his talent in using the sword, all the changes in his moves and the flow of his force were extremely natural. Deceiving Kaunitz, who was not even a knight, was a piece of cake. Even if Kaunitz grew suspicious, all he had to do was provoke him. During this period of time, he could also see that although Kaunitz looked arrogant and cold, he was still a 16-year-old youth. Although his swordsmanship was powerful, he was actually very simple. He had immersed most of his life in swordsmanship. However, after losing consecutively for over a month, Fang Xinjian did not plan on losing anymore. Today, after finishing up his work at the School of Sword Arts, he left the training grounds. There was no other reason other than that he had learned the Chaotic Strike, Silver Moon Prayer Sword Technique, Descent of Holy Light, and the Treasure-style Foundation Sword Technique that Kaunitz had performed. Kaunitz might know other sword techniques, but he had never used them before. At the start, Fang Xinjian had been trying to tempt him, but he soon realized that Kaunitz's strongest moves were probably these 4 sets of sword technique. Therefore, he would not try to use sword techniques of the same level as the Grizzly Bear Sword technique to defeat him. External nurturing techniques were the basics, while internal nurturing techniques were of a higher level. Therefore, the 9 Yang Sword technique was of a higher level than the Grizzly Bear Sword technique, while the Chaotic Strike was of a higher level than the Eagle Sword technique. This was a principle that every faction knew. Therefore, Fang Xinjian did not plan on practicing in the training grounds anymore. The sword techniques that he was going to practice were not meant to be practiced in front of others. The prefectural selection will be held in the last 3 months. As long as I obtain the official status of a knight, I'll have more resources to train with. When the time comes, I can even reveal some of my talents. Because of my official status, others won't be able to deal with me easily. Seeing Fang Xinjian leave after breakfast, Second Marshal Brother Lambert's face revealed a hint of disappointment. Has he given up? That's right. After being defeated for so many days consecutively, no matter how strong a person is, he would feel disheartened. I definitely can't do this. For the past few days, Ogden's face had been exuding a hint of confidence. This was because he had finally comprehended the profoundness of the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique and learned the first level. His internal organs had already grown strong and healthy under the practice of the 9-yang divine sword technique. Very good, there's still 3 months left. As long as I can bring the 9-yang divine sword technique to level 2 within these 3 months, the chances of me getting into the prefectural selection will be higher. Thinking of this, Ogden's aura changed once again, and his face seemed to be shrouded in a layer of color. Vivian was practicing with Count It. As Fang Xinjian had left, she was the one practicing the grizzly bear sword technique with Count It's today. However, she had only trained in the School of Sword Arts for a few years, and her grizzly bear sword technique was only at level 5. With her understanding of the grizzly bear sword technique, she would always be defeated by Count It's within a few moves. After all, Count It's' attributes were much higher than Vivian's. His strength and agility were both around 30, while Vivian's was at most 15. They were like adults compared to children, and no matter what moves Vivian executed, it was useless. In the end, Count It's could only carefully control his strength and agility, trying his best to maintain the same level as Vivian in order to be able to exchange blows. Take a break. Count It sighed. Looking at the weak and bashful Vivian before him, he was too embarrassed to say anything harsh. Vivian had a pitiful expression on her face. I'm sorry, Brother Count It. My training was too poor. It's all right. I'll just give you some pointers in the afternoon. Count It asked. Oh right, do you know where Fang Xinjian went? It's not easy to find such a good target. Vivian shook her head with an innocent expression. I don't know. I'm not that close to him. However, after being taught a lesson by you for so many days, I guess he's afraid? Afraid? Doesn't seem like it. Count It sighed. Was I too ruthless yesterday? On the other hand, after Fang Xinjian left the School of Sword Arts, he headed straight for a slum a few streets away. He walked to a corner of a wall and jumped on the spot. When he was in midair, he stepped on the wall and leaped over the top of the wall. Then, with a push of his arm against the wall, he flipped over the 2-meter-tall wall. With his current physical attributes, it was a piece of cake for him to jump over such a wall. Raising his head, he saw a charred and collapsed house within the wall, as well as all sorts of rubbish. This was one of the houses that had caught fire in the slum last year. The 12 people in the house had all been burnt to death in their sleep. Because their deaths were too tragic, the house had been burnt to a pulp, and because no one cared about such a remote slum, not only did the government not care about it, the people in the vicinity only treated it as a rubbish bin. No one came in at all, and such a secluded place was suitable for Fang Xinjian to practice his sword arts. In fact, when he had discovered that he could secretly learn Count It's sword arts, he had already started to take note of such a secluded place, so that he could practice the sword arts he had secretly learned by himself. Holding the longsword given to him by the old man from the fishing village, Fang Xinjian started to practice Treja Knight Academy's sword arts. First was the chaotic strike. Chapter 23. The primal chaos strike was a sword technique created by a wise senior while he was observing the majestic mountains and peaks of the mountains. The most important point of this sword technique was to imagine the majesty of the mountains. When the sword was unleashed, each stroke and move had to be as heavy as a mountain. It sounded mysterious, but it was actually a change in the mind that would bring about a change in the blood. For example, when a person climbed to the top of a mountain and looked at the mountains and rivers beneath his feet, he would naturally feel broad-minded. Or, when standing by the seaside and looking at the endless sea, he would naturally feel relaxed and calm. All sword techniques created by observing nature were basically like this. Through observing nature, one could comprehend the concept within and use the concept to change the internal state of the human body. For example, when a person was angry, afraid, or nervous, his blood pressure would rise. When a person was happy and relaxed, his blood vessels would relax, and even the burden on his internal organs would be reduced. This was the principle of the mind affecting the body. and the chaotic strike was based on the majestic concept of the mountains, coupled with moves that twisted the muscles and bones to improve the blood circulation and massage the internal organs to maintain the internal organs. And the most important part of the body was the heart. The final goal was to strengthen the heart, make the blood as heavy as a mountain, and strengthen the ability of the blood to supply nutrients to improve the body's physique and physical strength. Although Fang Xinjian did not fully understand the principles behind it, he had already learned the entire process from Count. Moreover, Kaunitz had outstanding talent, and there was nothing wrong with the level 12 chaotic strike. This allowed Fang Xinjian to learn it even more smoothly. It was because of his extraordinary talent that Fang Xinjian had learned this sword technique. But even so, the current Fang Xinjian was still very careful. This was using the mind to affect the human body. How complicated was the human body, and how changeable was a person's mind. Moreover, it was related to the blood and the heart, an important part of the body, so there was no room for carelessness. Fang Xinjian's movements were as slow as an old man's. Every sword move was executed halfway or even one-third before he had to stop to ponder and play with it. It could be said that this was the slowest sword technique he had ever practiced. This chaotic strike is even more difficult than the 9-yang divine sword technique. Moreover, I don't have a teacher to supervise me. If I make a mistake, my blood vessels will rupture and my organs will fail. However, it was fortunate that Fang Xinjian's talent was far too outstanding. He pondered over the cultivation method for the chaotic strike bit by bit, and after a few days, he had a rough understanding of it. After over 10 days, he was already able to practice it without any obstructions. If Treja's sword arts teacher had seen this, he would have been so shocked that his eyeballs would have popped out. Just like that, Fang Xinjian would go to the school of sword arts once a day in the morning and at noon to do some chores and have a meal. Usually, he would spend most of his time in the ruins practicing his sword arts. As for the people in the school of sword arts, seeing Fang Xinjian go out to practice his sword every day, they had initially felt scorn for him, but then they became numb to it. After 2 months, they had basically gotten used to Fang Xinjian's actions. Ogden had advised Count and asked Fang Xinjian to apologize to Count. Lambert had asked Fang Xinjian if he needed help. Vivian had never spoken a word to Fang Xinjian. She was like a proud peacock, always by Kaunitz's side, displaying her charm. Kyle had also asked Fang Xinjian about this. I heard that you have some conflict with Kaunitz? Do you need me to mediate for you? No matter how powerful the Treja family is, Kaunitz will still have to give me face. Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, There's no need, teacher. I feel more at ease practicing alone outside. In the meantime, Kyle had also arranged for everyone to register for the prefectural selection. Kaunitz had also brought a few of his students to attend Treja's gathering. He and Vivian were now a couple, and it seemed that they had become a couple in the eyes of the people in the school of sword art. Even Ogden was much more courteous towards Vivian. Of course, everyone still spent most of their time practicing their sword technique. As the prefectural selection approached, the atmosphere in the training grounds became more and more oppressive. It was as if even the air was so tense that water could be squeezed out of it. Unknowingly, there were many warriors in the city who had come from nearby areas. They were all here to participate in the prefectural selection. Just like that, time passed by quickly. In the blink of an eye, another 3 months had passed. Finally, the day of the prefectural selection arrived. In the abandoned courtyard, Fang Xinjian stopped what he was doing and let out a deep breath. Chaotic Strike, Silver Moon Prayer Sword Technique, Descent of Holy Light, and the Treja Style Foundation Sword Technique. Each of these sword techniques was extremely profound, allowing one to see through the profoundness of the human body. For an ordinary person, even if they had the foundation of other sword techniques, they would still need at least 5 years to master each of these sword techniques. After all, Kaunitz was an aristocrat genius who had received guidance from countless famous teachers. He had started practicing his sword techniques from a young age, which was why he had been able to master these 4 sword techniques to the maximum level at the age of 16. When Fang Xinjian had reached level 10 in the Descent of Holy Light, he realized that his practice target overlapped with the 9 Yang Divine Sword technique. Therefore, he had not been able to add any additional attributes to it. He had also considered whether he could integrate the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 sword technique. However, even though his talent was sufficient, his experience in sword techniques was far from enough. After trying and realizing that he could not succeed, he gave up. Therefore, he spent all his time on the Chaotic Strike, the Silver Moon Prayer Sword technique, and the Treasure-style Foundation Sword technique. Every day, he would only sleep for 3 hours. The moment he opened his eyes, he would be practicing his sword technique. He would even practice his sword techniques in his dreams. Towards the end, Fang Xinjian even felt dizzy and his body went limp, developing feelings of disgust. However, when he thought of that night and that hatred, he forced himself to calm down and practice his sword technique. Taking into account the time that had passed, Fang Xinjian was only left with 4.5 years. There was no turning back. His efforts had paid off. Finally, on the last day before the prefectural selection, Fang Xinjian completed what he had thought to be an impossible task. He had trained the Chaotic Strike, the Silver Moon Prayer Sword technique, and the Treasure-style Foundation Sword technique to the maximum of level 20. Chaotic Strike gave him an additional attribute of +4 in strength, +4 in agility, +8 in endurance, and +4 in flexibility. The Silver Moon Prayer Sword technique gave him an additional attribute of +3 in strength, +3 in agility, +5 in reaction, +3 in endurance, and +3 in flexibility. The Treasure-style Foundation Sword technique had taken him a great deal of effort. It gave him an additional attribute of +2 in strength, +2 in agility, +2 in reaction, +2 in endurance, and +2 in flexibility. From the values of these additional attributes, it could be seen that as Fang Xinjian's attributes continued to increase and his physical body became stronger, the additional attributes provided by his sword techniques also decreased. On one hand, this was because the attributes that were released from his body were decreasing. On the other hand, the effects of the attribute values were increasing exponentially, making it harder for him to increase the attribute values through his training. Chapter 24. Over the past 3 months, other than the additional attributes brought about by the improvement of his skills, his basic attributes had also improved after a long period of training. Therefore, Fang Xinjian's attributes had become: Name Fang Xinjian, age 16, occupation warriors, squire, level 9 strength, 36 agility, 42 reaction, 23 endurance, 30 flexibility, 32 skills. Level 20 single-handed sword mastery, level 20 cross/level 30 grizzly bear sword technique, level 30 eagle sword technique, level 30 tenor style body strengthening sword technique, level 29 yang divine sword technique, level 20 chaotic strike, level 20 silver moon prayer sword, level 10 descent of holy light, level 20 treasure style foundation sword technique. Specialties: Genius swordsmanship, survival instinct, internal healing, internal training, sword specialist. His current strength was more than twice what it had been 3 months ago, and his speed was so fast that he could leave afterimages within a short distance. Due to the increase in his physical strength due to the development of his internal organs, he could now rest for an hour or 2 every day and be full of energy. The integration of his muscles, bones, blood, and internal organs had also greatly increased his flexibility, allowing him to unleash his power perfectly when performing various sword techniques. As for Fang Xinjian, when he was practicing these sets of internal energy sword techniques, he had gained another 3 specialties. Internal healing has a certain level of control over the internal organs, allowing you to use your willpower to stimulate your muscles and bones, stopping and forcing internal injuries to heal temporarily. Internal training Subjective willpower can aid in the digestion of the internal organs, greatly increasing your absorption ability, increasing the effects of your martial arts training and food absorption. Of the first two specialties, one allowed Fang Xinjian to heal his own internal injuries, while the other increased the effects of his martial arts training on his attribute. The other specialty, sword specialist, was something that Fang Xinjian could not quite understand. Sword specialist increases the accumulated potential of practicing sword technique. This was a specialty he had obtained after reaching the maximum level for his 10th sword technique. However, he could not understand the effects of this specialty, and had given up on it after studying it for a while. He did not know that this was the specialty that Kaunitz had been dreaming of for a long time. He had even come to the Kendo Pavilion to learn basic sword techniques for this specialty. At the next moment, Fang Xinjian casually slashed out with his sword, and pitch-black sword shadows connected together, exploding out in the air like a clump of black fog. The sword's blade cut through the air, creating buzzing explosive sounds. The air was continuously compressed, forming air shock waves that were pushed forward. These shock waves were like sword cheese, colliding against the ground and walls, creating light popping sounds. At this moment, if Fang Xinjian were to compare himself to Kaunitz, he discovered that he could completely suppress Kaunitz in terms of attributes and sword technique damage. This made him even more confident in the upcoming prefectural selection. Taking a step forward, Fang Xinjian was like an arrow that tore through the air. His body emitted a whistling sound as he arrived at the foot of the wall in the blink of an eye. Then, he stomped down with his right foot, causing a muffled sound to ring out. It was as though the entire ground was shaking. Suddenly, a small crater the size of a foot was formed. Amidst the shattered ground and flying pebbles, Fang Xinjian had already leaped over the wall and was rushing towards the examination venue. As the date of the prefectural selection approached, more and more strangers appeared in Kurst. These were warriors who had rushed over from the nearby cities, towns, and even villages to participate in the prefectural selection. According to the official statistics, there were more than 3,000 people participating in this year's prefectural selection in Kurst. As Fang Xinjian rushed to the examination venue, he saw many strong and powerful warriors carrying sabers, spears, and staff. Their faces were filled with solemnity and nervousness, because the upcoming competition could very well decide their lives. The drill ground of the city guards institution was already packed with people. Fang Xinjian queued up at the entrance to verify his name, age, and other information. He then took out a number tag and wore it on his wrist. Fang Xinjian had been standing casually at the side, but after a while, he saw the eldest disciple of the School of Sword Arts, Ogden, appear before him. Ogden, who had already comprehended the 9-yang divine sword technique and had successfully reached level 2 in 3 months, was brimming with confidence. His strength, agility, and reaction attributes had all broken through 20 point. Behind him were a few other juniors who were also participating in the prefectural selection. After seeing Fang Xinjian, he could not help but smile and say, "Isn't this Junior Xinjian? After hiding for so many months, you're finally willing to come out and bask in the sun? It's not easy to train alone, right? How is it? Has the eagle sword technique leveled up after such a long time? Do you need me to give you some pointers?" Right, young Master Kaunitz is also participating in the prefectural selection. Aren't you going to meet him? Ogden laughed out loud. In his opinion, the person Fang Xinjian feared the most in the School of Sword Arts was Kaunitz, who had lectured him daily. Fang Xinjian laughed coldly in his heart. He glanced at Ogden and suddenly placed his hand on Ogden's chest. He then pushed Ogden's chest forcefully, like an adult pushing a child. Ogden's body continued to fly backward, stumbling for over 10 meters before finally landing on the ground with a thud. "You!" Having been pushed down by Fang Xinjian, his face flushed red and he thought to himself, "What's going on? How can his strength be so much higher than mine? Just then, on the stage in front of the drill ground, a red-haired knight dressed in knight attire clapped his hands and said slowly, "Since everyone is here, let's prepare to begin." This knight had thick and strong limbs and a full beard on his face. His red hair was like flames, fluttering in the wind. He did not shout loudly, but only opened his mouth softly. The sound waves were transmitted to the entire area as his lungs contracted. Ogden's face was ashen. He glared at Fang Xinjian, but did not do anything else. However, Fang Xinjian could not be bothered to look at him. He only stared at the red-haired knight and thought to himself, this person's internal organs are probably extremely condensed. His strength is equivalent to the muscles of an ordinary man's arm or thigh. He had asked around and knew that this knight was one of the examiners for this prefectural selection. He was Cursed City Guard Leader, Level 19 Hogan. For him to be able to reach Level 19, it was obvious that he had completed the first transition after becoming a knight. This person's abilities were only a step away from the second transition. It was said that he had participated in the regional selection before and was just a step away from becoming a conferred knight, gaining the right to go through the second transition in the Empire. As the red-haired knight spoke, everyone gradually quietened down. The knight nodded his head in satisfaction and said, "I'm Hogan, the examiner for the first stage." The Empire's prefectural selection was not a simple examination. It mainly assessed three aspects: physical strength, skills, and comprehension. Due to the large number of participants in the prefectural selection, the examinees were basically all warriors who had not even gone through the first transition. Therefore, duels were not arranged, as it was easy for casualties to occur. Thinking about a duel involving thousands of people, the duelists were all elites from various dojos and academies. Once there were casualties, it was very likely that it would cause a huge battle royale. This would also increase the frequency of armed fights, causing the Empire's rule to be unstable. Moreover, the level of one's battle prowess could not represent one's potential and talent. Therefore, the prefectural selection had long since removed the mode of duels. Instead, it was all sorts of tests and intellectual battles. Hogan continued, "The main venue for this prefectural selection is Cursed City's Royal Academy, which is about 12 kilometers away from here. You have 10 minutes to get there. Those who are late will be disqualified. Then, I'll be waiting for you there." As he spoke, Hogan's body flashed and he had already dashed out of the drill ground. The air whistled and the ground trembled. It was as if a herd of elephants were stampeding together. Every step he took would shatter the ground, creating small pits. The strong reaction force propelled his body, causing him to shoot out like a rocket. He even drew a faint stream of white gas in the air. What a fast speed! Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed. Such explosive power, strength, and speed are all above 50. No, it might even be above 60. With Hogan's display of power, the many warriors present also started to move, pushing and shoving each other as they dashed out of the drill ground. "Everyone, I'll make a move first. The Treja clan will be taking the prefectural champion title this time around." With a soft whistle, a silhouette soared into the sky. Kaunitz stepped on the heads of over 10 warriors, dashing out of the drill ground like a gust of wind. The City Guards Institute was surrounded by walls that were over 5 meters tall. If one wanted to leave at the fastest speed, they would have to go through the main gate. Kaunitz's circulation of force was extremely ingenious, cutting through everyone's bodies and using their bones and muscles as a medium to transmit his force. In an instant, he had dashed to the main gate. However, just as he was about to reach the main gate, a strong gust of wind whistled and the turbulence in the air blew against his face, making it hard for him to breathe. Scram! Following that, a huge shadow enveloped him. Chapter 25. Who is it? With a loud bellow, Kaunitz, who was in mid-air, twisted his waist and punched out fiercely towards the silhouette with his fair fist. The other side chuckled and punched out as well. Kaunitz felt an earth-shattering force rush into his body from the fist, and the overbearing force directly sent him flying. Bang! Amidst the loud sound, Kaunitz was sent flying over 20 meters away. He knelt on the ground, feeling that his entire right arm was extremely sore and numb. The vital energy and blood in his body were churning, and he could not exert any strength for a long time. He lifted his head and looked in disbelief at the man who had sent him flying. "Robert!" The man laughed and turned to squeeze his way out of the gate. He was over 2.5 meters tall, and his limbs were as thick as bridge piers. There were many burly warriors in the drill ground, but when they stood next to him, they were all as laughable as children. Wherever the man passed by, he was like a wild boar sprinting through the field. Wherever he passed by, the crowd was easily pushed aside like rice. With a few strides, he was the first to dash out of the drill ground. "Ha ha ha ha, the prefectural champion this time around can only be me, Robert Abel." As he laughed maniacally, he had already rushed out like a tornado. "Robert Abel? How is that possible? He should be the dojo master of the Tyrant Fist Dojo? Isn't he already at the first transition? This guy." Kaunitz clenched his teeth. Eldest martial brother Ogden walked over from behind and asked with concern, "Young Master Kaunitz, are you all right?" Kaunitz let out a cold snort and could not be bothered to reply. He dashed out once again. This time around, he was filled with anger and showed no mercy. He was like a crazed elephant, and wherever he passed by, people would be thrown off their feet. "Damn it, has Robert disbanded the Tyrant Fist Dojo?" Kaunitz thought to himself. If he disbanded the sect and defected to the Empire, even if he had already gone through the first transition, he would still be qualified to participate in the prefectural selection. Kaunitz knew that the Tyrant Fist Dojo was only a third-rate sect, and their legacy was only that of the first transition. As the dojo master, Robert was only at level 13 or 14 of the first transition. Normally, he wouldn't even care about a knight-level warrior like this. Even if he couldn't compare to the other party, his background was more than enough to suppress the other party. However, in the prefectural selection, it was almost impossible for him to win against his opponent and get first place based on his own abilities. For a warrior like Robert, who had already completed the first transition, his goal was the regional selection, which was above the prefectural selection. With Robert's sudden appearance, the atmosphere became even more solemn. As Kaunitz dashed out of the drill ground, 3 more figures broke through the crowd and dashed out. Dozens of people in front of them screamed in pain. They were either grabbed, pushed, or thrown out by the 3 people. The 3 of them were 1 woman and 2 men, all of whom had blonde hair and blue eyes. They more or less had the same temperament as Kaunitz. One of the women had a pale complexion, as if she had never seen the sun. Her figure was slender and graceful, like a fairy from the legends. With a few strides, she had already approached Kaunitz. Of the 2 men behind her, one had bronze-colored skin, black hair, and was dressed entirely in beast skin, as if he was a savage who had come out from the mountains. The other man was dressed entirely in white and had a cloak, looking spotless. When he looked at everyone before him, there seemed to be a hint of disdain in his eyes. As the 4 of them dashed forward, a huge force slammed into the ground, causing them to tear through the air like cannonballs, chasing after Robert. The woman laughed coldly and said, "Ha ha, seems like the fight for the prefectural champion this time around will be between our 4 academies and Robert." Kaunitz turned a deaf ear to what she said. He continued to adjust his breathing and the rhythm of his muscles, trying his best to conserve his energy. As for the 1 woman and 2 men, he was very familiar with them. As academies that were comparable to Treasure Academy, other than the School of Sword Arts and Cursed Royal Academy, there were 4 other academies that were also known as the 7 Pearl Academies. The 3 people before him were the representatives from the other 3 academies. The woman who had spoken was Fei Yong Knight Academy's representative, Barbara. The bronze-skinned savage was Shadow Moon Academy's representative, Boris. The remaining man dressed in white was Cursed Aristocrat Academy's representative, Ferdinand, who had been established together with Cursed Aristocrats. As they continued to dash forward, in the blink of an eye, they had already run out of the city. Other than Robert, they had become the second group, leaving the other warriors far behind. Barbara saw that the three men were running with their heads covered, ignoring her, and her pale face broke into a cold smile. She continued, "The latest news is that Robert has already completed the first transition and reached level 15. Disregarding his comprehension, just based on his attributes and techniques, he's definitely above us. It's impossible for us to fight for first place and become the prefectural champion by ourselves." The savage from Shadow Moon Academy, Boris said, "You want to join forces? How do I know if the people from Fei Yong Knight Academy are trustworthy?" "Ha!" Barbara smiled and said, "Savage, at least we can wait until we've dealt with Robert first before deciding on the winner. There are 3 stages in the prefectural selections assessment. They are physical strength, techniques, and comprehension potential. However, other than the first stage, which tests your physical strength, the other 2 stages are related to the direction of your martial arts cultivation. There were countless warriors in the Empire, but when the Empire organized the selection, they divided the factions into 5 main categories. They were sabers and swords, staffs and staffs, bows and crossbows, unarmed and miscellaneous. Barbara from Fei Yong Knight Academy continued, "Our academy specializes in archery. Savage, you've learned grappling, fist arts, and wrestling in the Shadow Moon Academy, right?" She then looked at Ferdinand, whose clothes were whiter than snow, and said, "Cursed Aristocrat Academy is most famous for spear arts, right?" Spear arts were naturally considered under the staffs category. As for Kaunitz, you'll naturally be tested on sword arts. Therefore, other than the first stage's physical strength, the 4 of us don't have much of a competition for the next 2 stages. As long as we join forces and win against Robert, we'll be able to take the top 4 places. As for who gets first place in the prefectural selection, that'll depend on our own abilities. Shadow Moon Academy's Boris said unhappily, "Robert specializes in the Tyrant Fist. If that's the case, won't I have to compete with Robert in the next 2 stages?" "Ha ha ha ha." Barbara let out a long laugh and said, "Then you can only blame your bad luck. In any case, we're not allowed to fight to the death in the prefectural selection. But with the 4 of us joining forces, it won't be difficult for us to delay Robert." Battles were prohibited in the prefectural selection, but as long as there were no injuries, no one would care about collisions and squeezes during running. "Let's do it," Kaunitz said calmly. The other 2 exchanged glances and nodded in agreement. But just as they were discussing, a loud thumping sound pounded on their hearts like drumbeat. A violent force struck the ground, causing the 3 of them to feel as if the ground was trembling. "Who's that?" The 4 of them turned their heads at the same time and saw a figure dashing toward them, leaving behind a series of afterimages. The speed at which he dashed made it seem as if he was bringing along a strong gust of wind. Wherever he passed by, sand and pebbles would be sent flying. In almost an instant, he had crossed a distance of tens of meters and overtaken the 4 of them, leaving behind a blurry shadow. The 4 of them wanted to stop him, but they could not change their direction in time. Kaunitz's eyes widened as he looked at the figure that was about to become a small dot in the blink of an eye. He said in a low voice, "Fang Xinjian?" The 4 of them shouted after him. Chapter 26. A minute ago, when Kaunitz and the other 3 had dashed out of the drill ground, Fang Xinjian had also made his move. He tightened his grip on the long sword at his waist and squatted down slightly. Following that, a wave of force had already blasted towards his legs like a bomb. A loud bang rang out. Fang Xinjian's legs seemed to swell up at this moment, and the ground beneath his feet caved in slightly like flour. He shot up into the sky like a rocket, flying over a distance of over 20 meters and over 100 heads. Following that, with another 2 bangs, he had already arrived at the door with 2 consecutive leaps. He did not have Kaunitz's lightning as a swallow movement technique, but he could forcefully rely on his attributes to achieve the same result. What? Eldest martial brother Ogden's eyes were wide open, his mouth so wide that he could swallow a duck's egg. He stared at Fang Xinjian's silhouette. This jumping ability, this explosive power. How can his attributes be so high? Even Kaunitz would not be able to do this. Beside him, a few juniors from the School of Sword Arts also had their mouths wide open, shouting in disbelief. Eldest martial brother, it's that Fang Xinjian? That Fang Xinjian who has been hiding for so many months and dared not come out? Second martial brother Lambert's eyes flashed as well, and he laughed. Good lad, just as I thought, you haven't given up. Then I'll have to work hard too. The next moment Lambert exploded, and the muscles all over his body swelled up like armor. He easily pushed away the surrounding participants and dashed towards the door. Ogden had also regained his senses, and his expression was extremely grim. Thinking back to what he had done in front of Fang Xinjian, he felt that it was extremely laughable. However, although he regretted offending Fang Xinjian, he still exerted all his strength and dashed towards the door. Damn it, how did Fang Xinjian improve so much? What's going on? This won't do. I've been too complacent after learning the 9-yang divine sword technique. It's better to ask young Master Kaunitz for help after this. Fang Xinjian is completely under Kaunitz's control. As long as he's around, he won't dare to touch a single hair on my head. According to his speculations, even if Fang Xinjian had surpassed him, no matter how powerful he was, it was impossible for him to surpass Kaunitz. As for Fang Xinjian, he did not care about what the others thought. He only had one goal in participating in the prefectural selection, and that was to get first place and enter Cursed Royal Academy as the prefectural champion. He would then enjoy the best treatment, the richest resources, and become even stronger. His body was filled with energy, and the power was like a fierce horse roaring in his body. He stomped on the ground again, and each step created a small pit on the ground. Then, his heels and toes were slanted in these small pits, and he pushed himself forward crazily with a strong driving force. In the blink of an eye, he had already overtaken Kaunitz and the others, rushing towards Robert, who was in the lead. When Barbara and the other 3 saw that they had been overtaken, their countenances turned cold. They had been holding back, but in the next moment they unleashed all of their energy. The 4 of them charged forward at full force, and in an instant, their speed was twice as fast as before. Charging at full force was a completely different situation from holding back. Kaunitz's 4 limbs muscles burst forth at full force, his lungs contracted violently, and his heart beat continuously like a drum, sending the required energy to his entire body. Kaunitz had thought that they would be able to easily overtake him by unleashing their full force. However, Kaunitz's eyes were wide open, and even though he was using all of his strength, Fang Xinjian's silhouette was getting further and further away from him. How is this possible? Kaunitz watched in disbelief as Fang Xinjian gradually got further away from him. He thought to himself in astonishment, my agility and strength attributes have already reached 30 points, but he's still able to shake me off like this? What are his attributes exactly? Barbara felt her lungs contracting continuously, and her heart was beating so fast that it felt as if it was going to burst out of her chest. Out of the 4 of them, her endurance was the weakest, and she was also the first to feel that her body could not take it anymore. Damn it, if this goes on, my stamina will be depleted. Thinking of this, although she was extremely unwilling, she still slowed down. She could only watch as Kaunitz and the others gradually left her in the dust. Kaunitz and the other 2 did not say a word about Barbara falling behind. Kaunitz, Boris, who was like a savage, or Ferdinand, who was dressed in white, all of their faces were flushed red. Their vital energy and blood, as well as their muscles, were being circulated to the extreme. Large amounts of perspiration and hot air kept coming out from their bodies, as if they were 3 engines that were operating crazily. They did not even have the energy to speak anymore. But even so, the absolute difference in attributes was not something that could be closed up by relying on an explosive burst within a short period of time. Before them, Fang Shijian's silhouette was long gone. Fang Shijian overtook Kaunitz and the others, gradually edging closer to Robert, who was in the lead. This man, who was over 2.5 meters tall and had already gone through the first transition and was already at level 15, did not perform any movement techniques or footwork. Just by taking large strides forward, he covered a distance of 10 meters with each step. He was even faster than a car on a highway. Just as Fang Xinjian was about 100 meters away from him, Robert turned his head slightly and threw a glance behind him. Oh, there's still someone who can catch up? After seeing Fang Xinjian, Robert's stone-like face broke into a provocative smile. He hooked his finger behind him and then started to slow down. Seeing Robert's actions, Fang Xinjian frowned. Although he was still edging closer to Robert, he had already reduced his speed and was on full alert. Just as the two of them got closer and closer to each other, when they were only 10 meters away from each other, Robert's body came to an abrupt halt. His legs abruptly came together, and the muscles in his calves exploded violently. With a loud bang, as if a cannon had been fired, Robert was sent flying back like a cannonball toward Fang Xinjian. With a height of 2.5 meters and a strength attribute of over 40 points, Fang Xinjian suddenly erupted with a strong gust of wind, causing Fang Xinjian to find it difficult to breathe. It was as if even the air had been compressed by this force until it became thinner. However, Fang Xinjian was prepared. The long sword at his waist struck out, and the sheathed longsword tapped on Robert's back. This time around, he was charging forward while Robert was retreating. With a thrust of his sword, this relative speed was enough to poke a hole through a metal plate. Even if Fang Xinjian had not unsheathed his sword, it would have been enough to make a warrior of Kaunitz's level break his bones and suffer internal bleeding. In reality, Fang Xinjian had wanted to force Robert to retreat with this one move. Who knew that Robert would not dodge at all and would just charge straight at him? However, when Fang Xinjian's sword stabbed into Robert's back, he felt as if he had stabbed into the armor plate of a tank. Robert's momentum was not affected in the slightest, but Fang Xinjian's arm felt numb. The long sword slipped out of his hand and he rolled away. It's as if I was hit by a train. Fang Xinjian rolled over 10 times consecutively before he stopped on the ground and stared at Robert. He felt as if the muscles in his right arm were being torn apart, and his palm was trembling so much that he could not lift it up. However, Robert revealed a provocative smile, hooked his finger at Fang Xinjian, and continued to run forward. This fellow. Fang Xinjian frowned. He used his left hand to grab the longsword beside him, stood up, and immediately chased after Robert. Chapter 27. Looking at Robert, who was charging around like a tank, Fang Xinjian secretly assessed his opponent's stats. My strength attribute is 36 points. In that exchange just now, this guy displayed at least 40 points of strength. This is probably not even his full strength. And when I stabbed his back, it seemed to have been blocked by a layer of something. Is it the extraordinary strength of a first transition job? Seeing that Fang Xinjian was still following behind him, Robert laughed coldly and said, "Haha, why? You're thinking of surpassing me? Don't you understand the difference between a first transition job and a non-first transition job? Brat, I can crush you with just one finger." He spoke loudly as he ran at high speed. He still looked calm and composed, displaying his strong physical strength. Fang Xinjian did not say a word. He only followed behind Robert at a distance of about 100 meters, neither increasing his speed nor retreating. Robert's eyes flashed and he started to change his speed. However, he soon realized that Fang Xinjian did not accept his provocation at all. The moment he increased his speed, Fang Xinjian would catch up. The moment he slowed down, Fang Xinjian would also slow down, maintaining a distance of 100 meters between them, neither getting closer nor further away. This lad. Robert's lips curled up into a smile. In the prefectural selection, examinees were not allowed to directly attack their opponents to eliminate them. At most, they could provoke Fang Xinjian verbally or collide with him while running. The reason why Robert had bumped into Fang Xinjian earlier was to disrupt his opponent's rhythm and deplete his physical strength. This would allow him to gain an advantage in the next two stages and lay down a better foundation. After all, the next two stages did not assess one's attributes, so his advantage as a first transition fighter would be greatly reduced. As a first transition warrior, he had participated in the prefectural selection solely for the sake of becoming the prefectural champion and the regional selection. A person like Fang Xinjian, who looked like he had great potential, could pose a threat to him in the second and third stages. However, it was clear that Fang Xinjian had no intention of going head-on against a first transition professional. Instead, he was determined to fight for the second place in the first stage. Robert knew that if he continued to pester Fang Xinjian, he would only be wasting his stamina and disrupting his rhythm, which would only do more harm than good. Thus, he glanced at Fang Xinjian a few more times and revealed a meaningful smile before continuing on his journey at his own pace. "Humph, you're smart. Don't come within 100 meters of me, or I'll cripple you." Fang Xinjian coldly stared at the other party, his eyes flashing with killing intent, but he didn't say anything. Now wasn't the time to show off. At the entrance of Cursed Royal Academy, about 12 kilometers away from the City Guard Institution's drill ground, the red-haired knight Hogan yawned. Beside him was the other examiner for the prefectural selection, Cursed Royal Academy's physical instructor, and also a first transition level 19 knight, Dick. This physical instructor wore a simple shirt and was bald. Regardless of whether it was his physique, appearance, or attire, he gave off a very plain feeling. Seeing Hogan yawning, he raised his brows and said, "In order to run 12 kilometers within 10 minutes, one must at least reach the requirement of 20 points in strength, agility, and endurance. The number of examinees who can pass this test is probably only 10% at most." Strength was related to the amount of resistance one's muscles could withstand during exercise, agility was related to the rate at which one's muscles could contract, and endurance was related to the endurance of one's muscles and blood vessels. In order to be among the best in long-distance running, it was obvious that these three qualities were indispensable. Physical instructor Dick continued, "I heard that this time around, Fei Yang Knight Academy, Treasure Knight Academy, Shadow Moon Academy, and Aristocrat Academy have all sent out representatives. Even the head of the Tyrant Fist Dojo has disbanded the dojo. Seems like this batch's results aren't bad, and there should be a few talents who can pass the regional selection. When that time comes, not only us, but even the City Lord and Headmaster's examinations will be much better." The Empire placed great emphasis on the selection of knights, and naturally placed great emphasis on the education of the various regions. The number of knights selected each year was a hard result for the officials' examinations. Hogan said lazily, "It's not that easy to pass the prefectural selection. Have you forgotten about the batch from 2 years ago? There were 2 freaks who were even stronger than you and me, but they were all wiped out. That's because there were too many monsters in the same batch. Moreover, I heard that Kaunitz has mastered all the basic sword techniques in Treasure Academy, and has even gone to the School of Sword Arts to further his training, aiming for the sword specialist specialty. For him to be able to do this at such a young age, he will definitely be able to go through the second transition in the future." Dick clearly knew a lot about the few seated examinees in this batch. There's also Shadow Moon Academy's Boris. It's said that he was born with 3 specialties, and is a genius among geniuses. Fei Yang's Barbara is also not bad. A few teachers have taken a liking to her and want to take her in as an apprentice. There's also Ferdinand. He's the city lord's nephew, and has been carefully nurtured by the Aristocrat Academy since he was young. It's said that the Academy's Spear Techniques department has already planned out his first transition career and development path. I think that after they train for a few years, they will all have the chance to stand out in the regional selection. Who can say for sure what will happen in the future? Hogan's eyes suddenly narrowed and he said, "Someone's here. They're faster than I thought." The first one is naturally Robert. Dick's eyes narrowed slightly, and he had already seen the figure dashing over from a few hundred meters away. However, when he saw the black dot behind the other party, he was slightly stunned. To think that there's someone who can chase after them so closely? It seems that one of them has been concealing his abilities. Is it Kaunitz, Barbara, Ferdinand, or Boris? Under Dick and Hogan's astonished gazes, Robert took a few strides and finally entered the Royal Academy's main gate. There were already staff members at the side recording his name, number, and result. However, when they saw Fang Xinjian's figure, they were all taken aback. "Where did this guy come from?" Dick asked in surprise. "Won't we find out later?" Hogan smiled. "Dick, you were saying that Kaunitz, Robert, and the other 4 would take the top 5 places, and that they would have a chance of passing the regional selection in the future? I feel that compared to them, this guy has more hope." Dick had not expected that he would be slapped in the face by reality, and even be mocked by Hogan. Dick's countenance sank slightly, and he said, "This shows that His Majesty has enlightened the world, and also the prosperity of Kirst's martial arts. Therefore, the more geniuses there are in this year's regional selection, the better. I can't wait for a few more geniuses to slap me in the face." Saying this, he suddenly changed the topic, saying, however, the regional selection is not just a test of one's attributes. Potential and talent are the key. For him to be able to come in second in terms of stamina, it doesn't mean that his talent and potential have surpassed Kaunitz and the others, nor does it mean that he's really a genius. In this aspect, I think more highly of Kaunitz and the others. Dick looked simple and honest, but from just a few words, it could be seen that he had a lot of thoughts in his head, and was not someone who was easy to deal with. In fact, he was born into an aristocratic family, and was a vicious person who knew when to advance and when to retreat. He would often use unscrupulous means to achieve his goals. Chapter 28. Hogan naturally knew of Fang Xinka's character, and thus did not have a good relationship with him. He smiled and said, "Hee, talent is not something you can tell with just one look." Dick glanced at Fang Xinjian. Seeing his tattered clothes and weather-beaten face, he immediately knew that he did not have much of a background and was just a commoner. He said, "Oh? Then you feel that he is very talented?" He was born into a noble family, and what he looked down on or envied the most were commoners with outstanding talent. When he first saw the sloppy-looking Fang Xinjian, he felt slightly displeased. Hogan, on the other hand, was born into a poor family. Upon seeing Fang Xinjian's appearance, he knew his situation and felt a sense of familiarity. Hearing Dick's words, Hogan smiled and said, "I feel that he is not bad. How about it? Do you want to make a bet with me? He will be able to get into the top 5 in this prefectural selection." Top 5? Dick frowned slightly. Robert had already gone through the first transition, and there was no way that Fang Xinjian would be able to defeat him. If he wanted to get into the top 5, he would naturally have to surpass one of Kaunitz, Barbara, Boris, or Ferdinand. Surpass the 4 of them? All of them are geniuses, and in 10 years' time, they will be Kirst's pillars. Where did this poor lad come from to surpass them? Is that possible? Dick asked softly. How much are you betting? How about 100 gold? Hogan smiled nonchalantly. Hearing this answer, Dick was astonished and said, 100 gold? That was his annual income. However, after considering for a few seconds and taking a few glances at Fang Xinjian, he thought to himself, Kaunitz and the others have all been nurtured since birth. Teachers, martial arts, medicinal cuisine, and an endless supply of food. It's a certainty that they will be able to go through the first transition. Their target has always been the second or even the third transition. If even such geniuses are surpassed by a poor lad, then what's the big deal if I lose 100 gold to Hogan? Thinking of this, he smiled and said, All right, Hogan. Then I'll wait to collect the money. On the other side, Fang Xinjian and the others had already registered their names. In less than half a minute, Kaunitz and the other three had also caught up. They looked at Fang Xinjian as though they were looking at a monster. From start to finish, they were unable to catch up with each other. This was especially so for Kaunitz. He kept sizing up Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian seemed to have suddenly become a stranger. His appearance naturally attracted the attention of the other three. Barbara looked at Fang Xinjian with an unpleasant expression, then asked Kaunitz, You know him? Yes. At that moment, Kaunitz revealed the other party's information. A month ago, he was no match for me at all. How is it possible that he has completely surpassed me in terms of physical strength now? You said he's a commoner with no background. Shadow Moon Academy's Boris asked. Kaunitz said unhappily, This pauper couldn't even afford to eat before this. Without a background to learn advanced nurturing techniques, without money to buy herbs, medicinal cuisine, or even nourishment from ferocious beasts, the possibility of him surpassing you in terms of attributes is very small, Boris said. Unless he has some specialties that increase his attributes. Ferdinand, who had not spoken all this while, took a few deep breaths. Only then did he feel that his fatigued body had recovered a little. He said, Maybe he has some specialties that allow him to run long distances. Hearing his words, the eyes of the other three lit up, and they said, That's very possible. Their deduction was also very logical. The four of them had been nurtured meticulously by the few major influences since young. They had spent countless amounts of money, eaten countless medicinal cuisines and ferocious beasts, and had gone through endless hard training. To be able to surpass them in terms of attributes when they were at the same level 9 before the first transition, it would probably only be possible for those renowned superfactions in the Empire, or the royal family, or the disciples of the Empire's core influences. In fact, this was indeed the case. If Fang Xinjian did not have the world's best talent with the sword, even if he trained for 24 hours a day, he would definitely not be able to surpass Kaunitz and the other three in terms of attribute. Humph, it's already impressive that you've surpassed us in terms of physical strength. However, it won't be so easy from now on. This time around, I must get second place. Barbara looked at Fang Xinjian's face and smiled coldly. She was the most confident and prideful amongst the four of them. This time around, she had lost to Fang Xinjian by just one move. She was extremely indignant. Kaunitz looked at Fang Xinjian and thought, This lad's potential is stronger than I had imagined. However, thinking of how Fang Xinjian had lost to him time and time again over the past few months, he did not think that Fang Xinjian would be able to surpass him. Why don't I bring him into the clan as soon as possible? The potential that this guy has displayed is much stronger than that of many of the clansmen. Father will definitely agree to this arrangement. When the time comes, I'll get him to practice the School of Sword Art's 3 sets of basic sword techniques with me, and I'll be able to obtain the specialty sword specialists sooner. As for Ferdinand and Boris, although they were astonished that Fang Xinjian had been able to surpass them in the first round, they, who had been nurtured as elite warriors since young, did not lack confidence. At least for now, the only opponents in their eyes were the geniuses from the other 3 academies. Not long after, more and more examinees arrived at the entrance of the Royal Academy. However, they were unable to attract the attention of Kaunitz and the others. On the other hand, Lambert and Ogden had arrived in the last 10 seconds or so, and the entrance was closed by the staff. An examinee panted heavily, kneeling outside the entrance. He looked in the direction of the Royal Academy, his face filled with despair. He grabbed the railing with both hands and cried, "Sir, I beg of you, please let me in. I was just a few seconds late. This is my last year participating in the prefectural selection. I beg of you, please let me in." A middle-aged man coughed as he shouted, "Sir, I caught a cold today, so I wasn't able to perform well. Please give me another chance. Sir, I beg of you. I beg of you." Seeing more and more examinees sobbing and crying out in grief outside the door, Fang Xinjian, Kaunitz, and the others all had strange expressions on their faces. Most of these examinees had participated in the selection several times, or even more than 10 times, but had not been able to pass. Some of them even had white hair at their temples, and their eyes were filled with despair towards life. Eldest Marshal Brother Ogden and second Marshal Brother Lambert exchanged glances, their eyes filled with rejoicing. Just last year they had been like the people outside the entrance. Hogan clapped his hands and said, "All right, you don't have to worry about those failures outside the entrance. Now, follow me and prepare for the second round." Following that, the examinees who had passed the first round followed Hogan into the depths of cursed Royal Academy. Fang Xinjian did a quick count and realized that there were only slightly over 300 people who had passed the first round. Chapter 29. Just the first stage of the prefectural selection alone had already eliminated more than 90% of the examinees. One could see how cruel it was. The remaining examinees were all extremely nervous. However, the scenery within the Royal Academy attracted everyone's attention. Of course, the scenery here was not the vast training grounds, the rich equipment, or the castle-sized teaching blocks, but the people they saw on the way here. All sorts of youths, middle-aged men, young ladies, and old men. They were either training, taking a stroll, gathering together to chat, or playing chess. All of them looked relaxed, their faces filled with a sense of success and pride. The only similarity they had was the knight attire they were wearing. All of them were knights. Cursed Royal Academy only accepted knights who had passed the prefectural selection every year. Therefore, all the students here were naturally knights. In the short 5-minute journey, they had seen at least 20 knights. When had the 300 examinees who had passed the first stage ever seen so many knights in the same place? They looked at those knights in their attire. Some were majestic, some were suave, some were domineering, and some were elegant. Almost all of them had a strange charm, exuding a strong aura of life. Every examinee looked at these knights, their eyes filled with yearning and envy. The knights here were 100 times more fortunate than those university students from Tsinghua University on Earth. Ogden's and Lambert's eyes were also slightly agitated. To be able to live in a place like this without having to worry about food and clothing, with subsidies from the country, various resources provided for their cultivation, social status that far exceeded that of ordinary people, and authority that could not be restricted by ordinary laws, this was the life they had always dreamed of. This showed the difference between ordinary people and the aristocrat. Most of the commoners felt uneasy when they saw so many knights. Their expressions were reserved, and their eyes were filled with inferiority. On the other hand, the aristocrats were calm, and could even greet many of the knights. "Hey, Kaunitz? You've really come." A knight with a slender figure and a somewhat feminine appearance walked to the side of the group. Beside him, there were a few other knights, but they seemed to see this feminine man as their leader. "Senior." Kaunitz nodded slightly. "Hee, all the best. Strive to become the prefectural champion for our Tresia Academy." That feminine knight seemed to be just passing by, leaving after a brief greeting. Thereafter, Barbara and Ferdinand from the Aristocrat Academy also met people they were familiar with. A few of their relatives and seniors had all become knights and were studying in Cursed Royal Academy. The eldest martial brother of the School of Sword Arts, Ogden, said enviously in a low voice, "They've been able to live with knights since young, meet them often, and even receive guidance from them. It would be strange if their results weren't better than ours." "So what? Fang Xinjian's result this time is about the same as theirs," Lambert said, a little unconvinced. Do you think Fang Xinjian can surpass them?" Ogden shook his head and looked at Kaunitz and the others with envy in his eyes. "I think Fang Xinjian should only be ranked 6th in the first round. He lost to Kaunitz every time he was in the kendo gym. How could he possibly win this time?" Lambert was silent. He could not refute this. It was obvious that the two of them were the last batch to enter the academy, and had no idea of the sequence in which Fang Xinjian and the others had entered. In fact, other than the staff and examiners who were in charge of registration, other than Kaunitz and the others, it was impossible for the other examinees to know. Not long later, the group arrived at a huge training ground with marble floors. There were already tens of examiners waiting there. Dick threw a glance at the examinees and said, "Having passed the first round of physical fitness, you can already be considered the most elite warriors in the vicinity of Cursed. However, if you wish to become knights and enjoy His Majesty's glory, these are far from enough. A strong physique, highly skilled techniques, and unparalleled talent. Only those who fulfill these 3 conditions can become knight. The second round tests your skills and technique. Based on the common classifications in the world, there are 5 categories: sword and saber, staff and rod, bow and crossbow, unarmed, and miscellaneous. Work hard, everyone." Fang Xinjian swept his gaze across and saw that at the northernmost side of the training ground, there were 2 examiners who had written the words sword and saber. The other examinees also looked for the categories they were proficient in, and Kaunitz was the first to head towards the examiner for sword and saber. Not long later, the 5 major categories were filled with people. Fang Xinjian took a look and saw that Kaunitz, Ogden, and Lambert were all there. There were about 80 people standing in the sword and saber category, and it could be said to be the group with the most people out of the 5 major categories. There were a total of 7 examiners in charge of the sword and saber category. Each of them was dressed in knight attire and had a solemn expression. The prefectural selections examinations concerned the future of every examinee, and it was also a political event that the empire's upper echelons placed great importance on. None of the examiners dared to be careless, and were extremely serious about the examinee's performance and grading. After the classification was completed, the leading examiner, who looked to be in his 50s or 60s, had black hair and yellow skin, and had an Asian face, said, "The examination is very simple. Each of you will take turns to come up and demonstrate your martial technique. Perform a variation of the sword technique that you are most proud of, and then exchange 3 blows with each of us. The 7 of us will give marks to each of you, and the average mark will be your results for this round. When added together with your results for the 3rd stage, it will be your total score. Those who are ranked in the top 10 will be able to pass the prefectural selection and become knights." The black-haired old man's expression was solemn and dignified. Every word he said was like the shadow of a sword flashing before their eyes. Under his gaze, the examinees present even felt as if they were being pressed against by the tip of a sword. Fang Xinjian could sense that the other party's sword arts cultivation must be extremely strong. Behind him, he could hear a few students conversing softly. "This is Cursed Royal Knight Academy's chief sword arts instructor, the other second transition expert other than the headmaster, Huang Lin. In the entire academy, only he and the headmaster are second transition experts. It would be great if one could become a knight and then be taken in as a disciple by him. How could that be possible? I heard that he hasn't taken in any disciples for 5 years, and only teaches sword arts during his lessons." This Huang Lin clearly had the bloodline of the western region, which was why he had black hair and yellow skin. But more importantly, he had the best sword arts cultivation in the entire academy. Fang Xinjian's eyes flickered slightly. If he could be taken in as his disciple, it would naturally be for the best. However, this would require him to perform well in the next 2 stages. Chapter 30. Number 22. Round Table Sword Society, Lope. These numbers had clearly been assigned to each examinee at the very beginning. Of course, as many examinees had already been eliminated in the first stage, the numbers were skipping quite a lot. With a call, an examinee drew the longsword at his waist, walked up to the 7 examiners, bowed, and then started to demonstrate a set of sword technique. This set of sword technique was complicated, light, and flexible, with the ability to change the strength of one's arm. The demonstrator's foundation was also very solid, and it was clear that he had completely mastered this set of sword technique. Seeing his performance, the 7 examiners each had different reactions. Some nodded slightly, some shook their heads and sighed, and some were expressionless. After the examinee had finished his demonstration, they wrote something down in their notebook. Next, the examinees took turns to exchange 3 blows with the examiners. 2 people walked into the examination hall, and the examinees performed the disciples' greeting. The examiners nodded slightly, and then they took the initiative to make their move. After a round of snatching credit, 3 moves were over. Locke hung his head dejectedly, as if he was not satisfied with his performance. Just like that, the examinees took turns to be tested by the examiners, who used the most picky gazes to scrutinize their sword techniques and cultivation. After the examination, there were some who beat their chests and stamped their feet, while others were overjoyed. Very quickly, over 20 people had finished this round. The staff members shouted, "Number 801, Tresia Knight Academy, Kaunitz." Is that Kaunitz? Tresia clan's current generation's super genius. The examinees moved, and in an instant, they started discussing in low voices. Even the 7 examiners were smiling and nodding, chatting with each other. This is Tresia clan's Kaunitz? A young knight in his 30s smiled and asked Huang Lin. He's Tresia clan's current generation's pillar. Sir, will you take him in as your disciple? Huang Lin, who had remained calm throughout the previous examinations, finally had a slight change in his gaze as he said, "We'll only know after seeing him." Amidst the crowd's discussions, Kaunitz revealed a confident smile. He had long since gotten used to being in the limelight. With a clang, his long sword was unsheathed, and Kaunitz demonstrated the Tresia Foundation sword techniques moves one after another. Seeing his set of sword techniques, the examiner's eyes lit up. His organs are vibrating, his 4 limbs are connected as one, his spine is as powerful as a giant dragon's, and there's also the sound of his heart beating. It's really perfect, an examiner said. His Tresia Foundation sword technique should have been trained up to level 10. No, according to the rumors, he has trained up to level 12. This kid's talent is so high, he will definitely become a sword master in the future. Not bad, not bad. Another examiner stroked his beard and said in satisfaction, the Tresia Foundation sword technique has extremely high requirements for the 5 viscera and 6 bowels, bones, and tendons. Once a mistake is made, not only will the body not be nurtured, it will also damage the foundation. Among the many training techniques, it is one of the most domineering ones. For him to be able to reach this level at such a young age, he really is a genius among geniuses. Both his internal and external training have reached a high level. This time around, after he becomes a knight, he'll probably be able to complete the first transition within a month. Another examiner with a white beard sighed and said, the Empire will have another rising star. Haha, I don't know about the other branches, but for the sword and saber branch, it seems like this year's champion will be decided. The young examiner looked at Huang Lin and asked, Sir, what do you think? Huang Lin nodded, and for the first time, a satisfied look appeared on his face. However, he still said, let's see how strong he is. Therefore, after Kaunitz had finished practicing the Treasure Foundation sword technique, the 7 examiners took turns to test him. They had different personalities and different sword technique. Some focused on attacking, some on defending, and some on simple exchanges of blows. After that, as the sword and saber clashed, they could feel the changes in Kaunitz's force. This kind of feeling was even more genuine than just watching. As expected, his internal and external techniques have reached perfection. I'm afraid there are not many people below knights who can surpass him in terms of techniques. I heard that he has also cultivated the School of Sword Art's 3 basic sword technique. I'm afraid that he will be able to attain the talent of a sword specialist soon. The last to take the stage was naturally the main examiner, Huang Lin. He did not draw his sword, but stood there casually and said, "Make your move. Sir, please give me some pointers." Kaunitz bowed, and the long sword in his hand flashed with electricity. All the muscles and bones throughout his body exploded, and it was as if the surrounding air had been ignited and exploded. His entire body compressed the air, and like a human-shaped Gundam, he thrust out fiercely towards Huang Lin. The air around him exploded, and the stone slabs under his feet shattered. The thrust of his sword was like the firing of a ballista. Among the people present, almost only the knights and a few of the most outstanding examinees could see the trajectory. For people like Lambert and Ogden, they could only hear a loud boom. Amidst the smoke, they saw Huang Lin stretch out his thumb and index finger and gently pinch Kaunitz's longsword in his hand. Huang Lin's actions were as if he was admiring fine wine or a famous painting. He rubbed the longsword between his fingers, recalling the force of Kaunitz's earlier attack. The force is not bad. Nodding in satisfaction, Huang Lin said, "1 attack is enough. There's no need for 2 more. An excited smile appeared on Kaunitz's face, while the others who had witnessed this scene looked at Kaunitz with envy and jealousy. In this round, the School of Sword Arts only had eldest martial brother Ogden, second martial brother Lambert, and Fang Xinjian left. The 3 of them were standing rather close to each other. Seeing this, eldest martial brother Ogden mumbled, "He passed with just 1 attack? Seems like Kaunitz will be first in the sword and saber category this time around. I wonder what his ranking will be in the top 5? With that, he glanced sideways at Fang Xinjian and laughed coldly. "Fang Xinjian, are you still thinking of catching up to young Master Kaunitz? It's not that I want to nag at you, but a genius like Kaunitz is destined to shine brightly and leave his name in history. It's better for us to maintain a good relationship with him. If he eats the meat, we'll be able to get rich just by drinking some soup. Since you're my junior, I'm telling you that you'd better apologize to him as soon as possible." Second martial brother Lambert had a complicated look in his eyes as he sighed in his heart. The difference between commoners and nobles, is it really that great? Why do these people have such monstrous talents? I've been training hard since I was 8 years old. Apart from eating and sleeping, all I do is practice my sword, not daring to slack off at all. But now, I'm not even half as good as him. Fang Xinjian could not be bothered with Ogden anymore. They were not even in the same dimension. He looked at Huang Lin with a grave expression. To be able to borrow Kaunitz's attack without even moving his fingers, and not even using the extraordinary strength of a first or second transition fighter. How high are Huang Lin's attributes? 100. 120. Fang Xinjian did not know, because that was far beyond the field he was familiar with. He only knew that in a second transition situation, Huang Lin was definitely much stronger than 99% of the second transition warriors in Demonic City. Following that, the other examinees took turns to compete. However, none of them performed as shockingly as Kaunitz. Some of them even caused the examiners to shake their heads in dissatisfaction. Next, number 2034, The School of Sword Arts, Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed as he drew his sword and walked out. However, he still had not decided which set of sword technique to practice. Kaunitz's level 12 Treja-style foundation sword technique had already amazed the examiners. If Fang Xinjian were to demonstrate his own level 20 Treja-style foundation sword technique, he would only get an even better result. Compared to ordinary basic nurturing techniques, these sword techniques that could nurture the internal organs and improve one's physique were truly profound and mysterious. They would be able to display a higher level of technique. Practicing such internal sword techniques was much more powerful than practicing external sword techniques like the grizzly bear sword technique or the eagle sword technique. In comparison, if he were to practice ordinary basic sword techniques, he would be naturally weaker. However, looking at the 7 examiners before him, as well as Kaunitz, Ogden, and Lambert, who were also looking at him, he knew that he could not reveal that he had learned the Treja-style foundation sword technique and the other sword techniques that belonged to Treja Knight Academy. Although the 9 Yang Divine sword technique belonged to the School of Sword Arts, Kyle had not imparted it to him. Although these few sets of sword techniques were of a high level, they had not been obtained through legitimate means. He could not possibly take them out. I'm already in second place in the physical test. Even if I were to only practice basic sword techniques like the grizzly bear sword technique in this test, I would at most fall behind Kaunitz. I would still be able to get into the top 10. Then I can only give up on getting a better result in the second test and fight for a better ranking in the third. Chapter 31. Therefore, Fang Xinjian walked up and started practicing the level 30 grizzly bear sword technique. At the start, when the examiners saw that Fang Xinjian was only practicing the basic sword techniques of the School of Sword Arts, they were not surprised. But as Fang Xinjian moved his longsword, the vital energy, blood, and muscles in his body started circulating. His longsword pierced through the air, creating a thunder-like buzzing sound. Every time his sword hit the air, it would create a series of explosive sounds. Oh, this grizzly bear sword technique has a solid foundation. Although it doesn't control the internal organs, just the strength of the muscles and bones is already the best among those present. A white-bearded examiner laughed and said, "To think that other than Kaunitz, there's another good seedling in this year's prefectural selection." Although his grasp of technique is not as good as Kaunitz's, with this grizzly bear sword technique, his understanding of the circulation of force in the muscles and bones can be said to be the limit of those who have not completed the first transition. It's a pity. If not for Kaunitz, he would be first. Following that, the examiners tried out Fang Xinjian's sword techniques one by one, and all of them revealed satisfied expressions. The young examiner looked at Huang Lin, who was standing at the side. When he saw Huang Lin's score, he was shocked. "Sir, this score." He could not understand why Huang Lin would give Fang Xinjian a higher score than Kaunitz, giving him a full score. Huang Lin shook his head and said, "We'll talk about it after the third stage. By then, you might all have to change the score you gave him." The young examiner continued to ask a few more questions, but Huang Lin refused to say anything more. This caused the examiner to look at Fang Xinjian curiously, unable to figure out what was so special about Fang Xinjian that Huang Lin would give such a high score. However, this was only a discussion between the two of them, and the other examinees did not know about it. Just like that, although Fang Xinjian's performance was not as good as Kaunitz's, he was still one of the best. Such a situation caused everyone present to look at him with envy. Kaunitz nodded and thought to himself, "Not bad indeed. Although he isn't able to control his 5 viscera and 6 bowels like me, his control over his muscles and bones is almost on par with mine. This lad's improvement is really fast." Interesting, it seems that teaching him a lesson every day for the past few months has stimulated his fighting spirit. But from the looks of it, He needs to be taught a few more lessons before he can use it. Although eldest martial brother Ogden and second martial brother Lambert felt that Fang Xinjian's grizzly bear sword technique was very powerful, even a little more powerful than theirs, they had not been able to tell that there were so many teachers present. Of course, they would not have been able to tell the true difference between them. They would not have guessed that his grizzly bear sword technique had already reached level 30. But when Ogden saw Fang Xinjian come down, he could not understand. Fang Xinjian to Xinjian to Fang Xinjian, he said. Xinjian, one Xinjian, Fang sword Xinjian. Fang Xinjian, and Xinjian was young. Fang Xinjian, finally, Fang finally, sun, finally, when all 80 people were finished, the sun was already setting in the west, and it was almost time to set. Although the examinees had finished the second stage, other than Fang Xinjian and Kaunitz, who were more obvious, most of the examinees did not know their results. They only looked at the 7 examiners nervously. Huang Lin coughed and said, "All right, the second stage is over. Next, I'll bring you guys to dinner. After dinner, we'll proceed to the third stage." Next, the group of examinees was brought to the academy's canteen. A sumptuous dinner had already been prepared. Most of the examinees had not eaten anything since morning and were already famished. Fang Xinjian also rubbed his belly, feeling extremely hungry. He walked up and grabbed a few plates of food to eat. The food in the Royal Academy was naturally many times better than that in the School of Sword Art. However, other than Fang Xinjian, the other examinees were only half full before they focused their attention back on the examination. In the entire canteen, Fang Xinjian was the only one who kept stuffing food into his mouth. It had been a few months since he had eaten to his heart's content. Every day, he was only half full, and he still had to practice his sword arts. This made him extremely hungry. An examinee who was sitting close to him could not help but kindly remind him, "Eating too much is not good for digestion, and it will even slow down your thinking. Do you still want to participate in the prefectural selection?" Fang Xinjian could not be bothered with him. With his appetite, even if he ate everything on the table in front of him, he would only be half full. Seeing that he was eating even faster, a commoner examinee let out a cold snort. "I despise those who like to take advantage of others." Of course, Fang Xinjian turned a deaf ear to them. His heart was like an iceberg, only burning up when he thought about what had happened in Demonic City. Moreover, with his stamina, he was only half full after eating so much. When the others, especially the aristocrats, saw how he was behaving like a refugee, they could not help but reveal looks of disdain. Eldest martial brother Ogden and second martial brother Lambert both had awkward expressions on their faces. They picked up their plates and moved a few meters away from Fang Xinjian. In a corner of the canteen, Dick and Hogan were sitting opposite each other. Dick smiled and said, "I just asked about the situation with the sword and saber team. Kaunitz had a complete victory over Fang Xinjian. Hogan, don't you think you can start preparing your bet?" Hogan frowned and said impatiently, "The bet is not over yet, why are you in such a hurry?" Dick only said proudly, "I'm not in a hurry. It's just that the thought of being able to win 100 gold from a miser like you makes me extremely happy." Hogan glared at him and said coldly, "The prefectural selection is not over yet. Don't be so full of yourself." "Haha, I've already asked around. Fang Xinjian has only learned 3 sets of basic sword techniques in the School of Sword Art." Dick said maliciously, "Moreover, for the past few months he has been competing with Kaunitz in basic sword techniques every single day, and he has lost to him. In the second stage, his total score was also lower than Kaunitz's. Do you really think that he still has a chance?" Seeing Hogan's surprised expression, Dick laughed even more happily. The difference in their talent in sword arts is like the difference between the clouds and the mud. Fang Xinjian does indeed have the talent to become a knight, but Kaunitz's future is that of a second or even a third transition. The two of them are not from the same dimension. Hogan, not only is your judgment as bad as before, your temper is also as rash as before. You dare to bet with me without knowing anything. You better change that bad habit of yours. Hogan was so angry that he stood up. He could not be bothered to look at Dick's smug expression anymore and turned to leave. On the way, he saw Fang Xinjian eating and drinking to his heart's content. He suddenly felt that he had misjudged him. Kaunitz, Barbara, and the other three were not gathered together. The upcoming examination would depend on themselves and had nothing to do with the others. They were all resting with their eyes closed, preparing for the final push to fight for the first place in the prefectural selection. Just then, another piece of news came from the examinees. Have you heard? That Robert Guy got full marks in the previous stage. What? Full marks? Of course. He is already at the first transition. It's normal for him to get full marks in this kind of examination that tests us. It's too unfair. Why should a knight be allowed to participate in the prefectural selection with us? Robert, who was seated at the dining table, revealed a smug smile, while Kaunitz and the others frowned. The difference between a first transition and a non-first transition knight is still too great. Since that's the case, we can only do our best to fight for the second place. Only after entering the academy will we be able to obtain more resources. Thinking of this, Kaunitz and the others slowly gathered their energy, making the final adjustments for the upcoming examination. They knew much more about the ranking of the top 10 compared to the ordinary examinees. Although the top 10 would be able to obtain the qualifications to become knights, the nurturing, resources, and attention the 1st and 10th place would receive in the academy would be completely different. This was especially so when it came to the selection of mentors for techniques and specialties. The higher one's name was, the more advantageous it would be. Just like a rolling snowball, the slight difference in ranking would cause the gap between their abilities to grow wider and wider. After the meal, the third stage was naturally split into 5 groups. The people from the saber and sword group were brought to a training room the size of a football field. The moment they entered, they were attracted by the countless images on the stone walls of the training room. They were images of men wielding longswords, practicing sword technique. This was a set of sword techniques that had been carved on the stone walls. Just as everyone was attracted by the sword techniques on the murals, Huang Lin's voice rang out. There are a total of 101 murals here in all directions. There are a total of 2 sets of sword techniques and 2 sets of saber technique. The content of the third stage is very simple. Each of you will have to choose a set of martial techniques to learn on your own. Before midnight today, all of you can come to the room next door and look for us for your assessment. Those who have not come for the assessment after midnight will be considered to have given up. We will determine your results for this stage based on your level of learning. Hearing Huang Lin's words, everyone present revealed bitter smiles. For ordinary martial techniques to be grasped, even with a teacher teaching them step by step, it would still take a few days or even a few weeks to learn the first level. For ordinary people to learn the martial techniques on the stone walls by themselves, even a few months would not be enough. Moreover, there were only 6 hours left until midnight. Even if almost all of the examinees here were dragons and phoenixes among men, it would still be extremely difficult. Seeing that most of the examinees were dejected, Huang Lin kindly reminded them, "We're not asking you to learn everything. Just learn as much as you can. The main point is to test your talent and learning ability. Then, you will be ranked according to your result. So, there's no need for you to sigh. Just do your best." With that, he left with most of the examiners, leaving behind a few staff to supervise the examinations to prevent the examinees from cheating, such as contacting the outside world or communicating with each other. However, Kaunitz did not say a word. He walked up to the first mural and started to study it. He thought to himself, With my talent, as long as I follow the prescribed order and don't perform abnormally, I'll definitely be ranked first in the saber and sword group. But if I want to surpass Barbara and the others and get a good ranking in the overall rankings, I'll still need some luck. Just as he was thinking this, he scanned through the mural and realized that the set of sword technique in the mural was extremely complicated and difficult to understand. Even for him, it was unlikely that he would be able to learn it within 6 hours. The other examinees also started to learn. However, they had no idea what the martial techniques on the mural were like, so they could only randomly pick one to learn. They did not know which one was easy and which one was difficult. Even when Kaunitz was learning, he could not help but think, "Damn it, what are these examiners thinking? To think that there's such a difficult set of sword technique?" Just then, he realized that someone was already walking toward the second mural. What kind of joke is this? He turned his head and saw that after Fang Xinjian had finished scanning through the first mural, he was heading toward the second one. And in Fang Xinjian's consciousness, an additional line had appeared on his techniques column. 9-headed dragon sword, 5%. Chapter 32. This set of sword technique is called the 9-headed dragon sword technique? Fang Xinjian stood before the second mural and looked at this set of sword technique. Compared to the first mural, the sword moves on this mural were slightly more difficult. The man on the mural was making unbelievable movements, twisting his body as much as possible. It was just like yoga on earth. However, although it was a little difficult, he still walked to the next mural after looking at it for 3 minutes. The 9-headed dragon sword technique was now at 10%. The third mural was even more difficult. The man on it kept on intertwining his hands. His legs, shoulders, and waist were all making movements that exceeded the limits of an ordinary person, twisting and turning like a snake. This mural took Fang Xinjian 5 minutes. Next was the fourth mural. Fang Xinjian continued looking at the murals one by one. After more than half an hour, he had already seen a quarter of the murals. At this moment, Kaunitz had just reached the second mural and was practicing his sword moves in front of it. Fang Xinjian's movements easily attracted the attention of all the examinees. Almost every time he moved, there would be people who could not help but look over. His rapid movements also made many examinees nervous. Seeing that he was heading to the next mural, eldest martial brother Ogden finally could not help but shout, "Fang Xinjian, are you done? You're affecting our examination." Fang Xinjian did not even turn his head as he continued looking at the mural. He could not be bothered with Ogden. Ogden could not help but scold, "Kaunitz is only at the second mural and you're already at the back. Who are you putting on an act for? You're only doing this to affect our examination." Following Ogden's words, most of the other examinees' attention was focused on Fang Xinjian, revealing faint looks of disdain as they looked at him. Seeing that Fang Xinjian was still ignoring him, he shouted to the invigilator, "Fang Xinjian is affecting our examination. Can you let him focus on his sword techniques?" The invigilator frowned and walked towards Fang Xinjian, saying, "You're indeed affecting the other examinees by doing this." Fang Xinjian smiled faintly. He had done a lot of homework before coming here. In fact, with his talent, it wouldn't be a problem for him to pass the night test. The key was how much talent he could reveal. In other words, the Royal Academy's acceptance and tolerance level towards a knight's demonic talent. Fang Xinjian wanted to understand this point, so he collected many relevant examples. In the history of the Empire, all kinds of geniuses emerged one after another. Among them, many monstrous geniuses were widely known. For example, 50 years ago, a super genius appeared in the southeastern region of the Empire. It was said that he started practicing martial arts at the age of 15, but it only took him 10 months to become a knight from an ordinary person. But he didn't end up well. Because he didn't accept the olive branch extended by the local nobles, his limbs were crippled and his spine was broken. He became a cripple. The culprit had naturally been captured and beheaded by the Empire, but no one knew who the mastermind was. On the contrary, there was a national knight from the Central Royal Academy in the capital of the Empire. At the age of 14, he passed the national selection and became a genius. This person started practicing martial arts at the age of 5. It was said that his best record was learning a spear technique in 2 hours. Then, in half a year, he trained it from level 1 to level 15. Fang Xinjian had heard about many geniuses. Some of them had fallen, while others had made a meteoric rise. This had something to do with talent, background, personality, and other factors. Therefore, he had a rough idea of the tolerance level of the Knight Academy's management. Learning a sword technique in 6 hours is definitely acceptable to the invigilators. Although geniuses of this level are rare in the Empire, they are not unheard of. At this level, they will definitely be valued, but they won't be too afraid, and won't want to control or suppress them. Although Fang Xinjian had thought about this for a long time, he was still a little nervous when it came to it. Therefore, his plan was to learn a sword technique in the shortest time possible and then pretend to give up. Then, he would pretend to be pondering over another set of sword technique. Just like that, he would secretly learn 2 sets of sword techniques, but on the surface, he would put in all his effort to learn 1 set of sword technique within 6 hours. Therefore, faced with the invigilator's question, Fang Xinjian replied, "I'm just looking at the general situation of this set of sword technique before deciding which one to choose." Fang Xinjian's reply was very reasonable, so the invigilator could not say much and only nodded. Although Ogden was not convinced, since the invigilator did not say anything, he naturally did not dare to continue looking for trouble. Following that, Fang Xinjian felt that he seemed to have gradually gotten used to the style of the 9-headed dragon sword technique. His speed of learning became faster and faster, and within a short 20 minutes, he had finished looking through all the murals of the 9-headed dragon sword technique. At this moment, Kaunitz had only reached the 4th mural. Lambert and Ogden were still looking at the 2nd mural. Then, Fang Xinjian did something that surprised everyone. He walked toward the mural of the other sword technique. What? Kaunitz could no longer sit still. He lifted his head and looked at Fang Xinjian. What the hell is this guy doing? Ogden let out a cold laugh, shook his head and said, trying to mystify things. What a waste of time. He secretly rejoiced, with Fang Xinjian going crazy like this, he might not even be able to get into the top 10. This way, the chances of me becoming a knight will be higher. Lambert looked at Fang Xinjian worriedly. What is this guy doing? Just then, Hogan, who had been hiding at the side, could no longer hold it in and walked out. Dick, who had made a bet with him, smiled and said, "Is this guy too nervous? Hogan, remember that you owe me 100 gold." Hogan walked up to Fang Xinjian and said coldly, "What's wrong with you? You've spent almost an hour researching the 9-headed dragon sword technique. Why are you here instead of seizing the time to continue your research? Are you wasting your time by doing this? Do you think that the prefectural selection is a game?" Towards the end, his tone was stern, and his eyes were filled with regret. Fang Xinjian looked at Hogan strangely, not understanding why Hogan was reminding him out of the kindness of his heart. However, it was impossible for him to give up on learning another set of sword technique. Therefore, he used the excuse he had prepared beforehand and said, "I've seen that set of sword technique, and it's not suitable for me. When I'm learning sword techniques, it's faster, much faster, to learn sword techniques that are pleasing to my eyes." Nonsense. Hogan pointed to the other side and said, "Scram back and learn the 9-headed dragon sword technique. Don't waste my time." His eyes were filled with regret. Fang Xinjian frowned and said, "This has nothing to do with you, right?" As he spoke, he saw a cold gleam flash in Hogan's eyes. He immediately shouted, "Hey, this person doesn't have the right to interfere in the examination, right? The invigilator, who had been watching from the side, looked at Hogan and said, "Sir, please conduct yourself with dignity." Hogan looked at the invigilators in the surroundings. Although they were just ordinary staff, not even knights, it was true that he did not have the right to interfere in the examinee's actions. Therefore, he glared coldly at Fang Xinjian and said, "You're abandoning yourself." With that, he flicked his sleeves and left, as if he could not bear to see what Fang Xinjian was going to do next. He left the examination hall, causing Dick to laugh out loud. Chapter 33. Fang Xinjian looked at Hogan's back, baffled, and continued to look at the second sword technique. Not long after, another sword technique appeared in his techniques column, hegemonic chi of heavens and earth. Different from the nine-headed dragon sword technique, which required extreme twisting of the body's flexibility and development of the body's potential, this hegemonic chi of heavens and earth was a nurturing technique, a training technique, or something else. From start to finish, it was just one slash after another. The only difference was that each slash's method of channeling force, angle, and technique were all different. The densely packed annotations at the side of the murals gave one a headache. There were over 10 examinees who were also learning this set of sword technique, standing before the first mural, thinking hard. Some of them shook their heads, wondering if they could learn another set of sword techniques like Fang Xinjian, but they were also worried that the other set would be even more difficult, and they would have wasted another hour. Fang Xinjian, on the other hand, had a smooth progress. He would be able to understand the diagrams and annotations after looking at them once or twice. However, this time around, his performance was not as fast as before. Instead, he stayed in front of each mural for a long time, and used his longsword to continuously demonstrate the moves, looking as if he was concentrating on comprehending the sword technique. However, in the eyes of others, his slow movements were still extremely fast. Before midnight, he had finished looking through all the murals for the hegemonic chi of heavens and earth. However, with the previous example, his actions were once again seen by others as being deliberately mystifying. When the last 10 minutes were about to end, everyone planned to wait until the end before queuing up with the examiner. While everyone was still immersed in their training, Fang Xinjian carried his longsword and walked towards the examiner's room next door. Ogden said in astonishment, "What is this guy doing? Is he crazy? Could it be that he has already learned that set of sword technique?" Thinking of this, he shook his head. "That's impossible. Kaunitz has only learned half of it. How could he have already learned it? Moreover, he has wasted an hour. Humph. Is it because the pressure from the examination is too great that he has given up? Right, previously, he was lectured by Kaunitz every day, and as a result, he did not dare to come to the sword pavilion. His willpower is very weak, so it's not strange that he has given up on the examination. What trash, wasting his talent." Kaunitz raised his head as well, looking at Fang Xinjian in bewilderment. "His talent is definitely not stronger than mine. But why did he go so early? What was he thinking? But if that's the case, his chances of passing the prefectural selection this time around will be very slim." One of the invigilators raised his eyebrows, but Fang Xinjian didn't break any rules by leaving early, so he just asked as usual, "Are you going to the examiner for the assessment? Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Fang Xinjian nodded and said. Therefore, under the gazes of many people who were bewildered, doubtful, disdainful, Fang Xinjian slowly walked toward the 7 examiners. After entering the room, the 7 examiners sat on their respective chairs. When they saw Fang Xinjian walk in, their eyes were filled with surprise. Usually, in the 3rd stage, very few examinees would come in early. They would only come at the last moment and queue up to enter. A white-bearded examiner looked at the staff member at the side and asked, "Is it time already?" The staff member replied, "There's still 10 minutes left." The white-bearded old man looked at Fang Xinjian with interest. Lad, there's still 10 minutes left. Why did you come in so early? Why didn't you spend more time thinking outside? In 10 minutes, you might have learned an additional move. The other examiners also looked at Fang Xinjian curiously. Only the main examiner, Huang Lin, smirked, revealing a mysterious smile. Fang Xinjian replied, "Because I've finished learning?" "Finished learning?" The white-bearded old man said in astonishment. "You're saying that you finished learning a set of martial arts from the mural in 6 hours?" Fang Xinjian nodded and said, "Hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth." "How is that possible?" The white-bearded old man stood up, his face filled with disbelief. "Do you know how long it would take for an ordinary person to learn this sword technique? A whole half a year. Even a knight would need at least a day to learn this set of swordsmanship. You're saying that you've learned it in 6 hours? The other examiners also broke out into discussion. All sorts of suspicions and hostile gazes kept sweeping up and down Fang Xinjian's body, as if they were going to tear him into pieces at the next moment. Fang Xinjian said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner, "Let me demonstrate this sword technique once and you'll know." The white-bearded old man was so angry that he laughed. All right. Demonstrate it once for me to see." Fang Xinjian drew out his longsword and slashed down at the old man across space. An aura of dominating the world gushed forth, and at the same time, Fang Xinjian, who was performing this slash, felt as if all the bones and muscles throughout his body had been run over by a truck. Even his muscles felt a little sore. It was clear that this sword technique gathered the power of all the bones and muscles, including the 5 viscera and 6 bowels, into one slash. It had a very high requirement for one's physical attributes and toughness. After one slash, another slash followed. Following that, Fang Xinjian slashed 16 times in a row without stopping. With each slash, there would be sword gales gushing forth, and the air turbulence swept through the entire room like a tempest. With each slash, Fang Xinjian's muscles became redder and hotter. White perspiration kept on oozing out from his body, increasing in quantity. It made him feel as if he had just run a few hundred kilometers. Slash. With each slash that Fang Xinjian performed, the examiners present became increasingly astonished. They looked at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a monster. This was especially so for the white-bearded old man. As Fang Xinjian slashed out with each slash, his eyes grew increasingly wide. In the end, his eyes were almost popping out. He pointed at Fang Xinjian, who had just performed the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth, and said in disbelief, You've really learned it?" All the other examiners were also in disbelief. They looked at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a monster. Seeing Fang Xinjian nod, an examiner suddenly asked, "That's not right. Have you learned this sword technique before?" That's possible. It's not like the examination questions have never been leaked before." "That's right. We have to investigate this matter thoroughly. Otherwise, if the examination questions were leaked, we'd become a joke." In an instant, all the examiners started whispering to each other. Their gazes toward Fang Xinjian were filled with all sorts of judgments and suspicions. This was very normal. When most examiners encountered such a situation, they would probably ask the examiner to thoroughly investigate the other party multiple times to ascertain the authenticity of the matter. Fang Xinjian had long since expected this. However, he was not afraid of any investigation. It was because he was very clear about the entire examination process. His previous experience in the School of Sword Arts had also been very simple. At most, he would just have to learn another sword technique. This could be easily verified. Just as most of the examiners were shouting out one after another, Huang Lin, who had been silent all this while, smiled and said, "Everyone, didn't you guys find it strange earlier and ask me why I gave this lad full marks in the second stage? After all, Huang Lin was a second transition conferred knight. He obviously had a lot of prestige among the examiners. With his words, everyone quietened down. Huang Lin revealed a mysterious smile, looked at Fang Xinjian and asked, "Your grizzly bear sword technique is probably not only at level 10, right? It's a pity that nurturing techniques are mainly used on one's body, improving one's physique and increasing one's potential. Therefore, I'm the only one who could tell." What? His grizzly bear sword technique has broken through to level 10? He's really a genius. If that's really the case, then he's a genius. No, he's a super genius. All the examiners looked at Fang Xinjian with scorching gazes, as if they were looking at a treasure trove. As for whether Huang Lin's words were correct or not, they had never doubted the veracity of a conferred knight's words. Moreover, even if they did not investigate this matter, once Fang Xinjian entered the Knight Academy, it would be exposed sooner or later. With regards to this problem, Fang Xinjian had long since been prepared to reveal a portion of his talent. After all, it was impossible for a person who could learn a set of sword technique and reach level 1 within a few hours to only have a level 10 grizzly bear sword technique. Therefore, he said calmly, level 15. In that instant, he felt the gazes of the examiners looking at him become 10 times more scorching. Huang Lin coughed and said calmly, "Have you acknowledged a master? I'm talking about a one-to-one personal disciple." Chapter 34. If Fang Xinjian still did not understand what Huang Lin was trying to say, he would be a fool. Moreover, with his talent, it would be great to have someone as powerful as Huang Lin to protect him. Therefore, Fang Xinjian half knelt and said, "Master, please accept my bow." "Good, good, good." Huang Lin smiled, looking at Fang Xinjian with a satisfied gaze. The examiners at the side shook their heads and sighed, feeling extremely regretful. Who among them would not want a disciple with a talent like Fang Xinjian's? Congratulations to Sir for accepting a good disciple. To think that after so many years, Sir has finally accepted another disciple. The white-bearded examiner smiled and shook his head. He pointed at Huang Lin and said, "Good, no wonder you refused to tell us why you gave him full marks for the second stage. So you've been thinking of accepting a disciple before us. Sigh, I really regret it. Why didn't I see that his grizzly bear sword technique had surpassed level 10? Ha! Huang Lin smiled and looked at Fang Xinjian, saying, "Your talent is very good. I'll accept you as my disciple for the time being." With that, his expression turned serious and he said, "But I'm very strict with my lessons. If you don't meet my requirements in the future, I'll expel you from the academy." Fang Xinjian's expression did not change as he said, "I'll listen to Master's decision." Huang Lin's expression softened and he said, You can leave first. Come look for me after you've reported to the academy." What he meant was that Fang Xinjian would definitely pass the prefectural selection. And that was the truth. With Fang Xinjian's results, if he did not pass the prefectural selection, no one else would be able to. Fang Xinjian backed off slowly. However, when he was halfway back, he still stopped. He had discovered a problem after performing the hegemonic chi slash of heavens and earth. A row of numbers had suddenly appeared at the bottom of his stats window. Current potential, 123300. What is this? He had wanted to go back and study it himself, but he suddenly remembered that this world had been digitized for many years, so the research on the stats window should be very thorough. So he stopped, turned around and asked, "Teacher, I have a question to ask." Huang Lin nodded. "Go ahead, but I still have to supervise the exam, so we'll talk about it later." Fang Xinjian hurriedly asked, "Teacher, do you know about potential?" He didn't dare to directly say that this thing had appeared on his interface. Instead, he asked in a roundabout way. Hearing Fang Xinjian's question, the 7 examiners present exchanged glances, and in the next moment, all of them burst out laughing. Seeing Fang Xinjian's puzzled expression, Huang Lin said, "You're not from a noble family, so it's normal that you don't know these things. Back when you were at the School of Sword Arts, you should have learned that the nurturing path is a way of accumulating and developing the body's potential, strengthening the physique, right?" Seeing that Fang Xinjian had nodded, Huang Lin continued, "The potential you're talking about is accumulated through the nurturing technique. But normally, you won't be able to sense it. Only after learning the training technique and depleting the potential will you be able to see it on your stats window." All the examiners present had experienced this before. Hearing this, they all nodded in unison. Huang Lin saw a hint of understanding flash across Fang Xinjian's face. He smiled and said, "Do you understand now? The hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth is a training technique. Earlier on, you've activated the potential display on your stats window. Trying to play tricks with us? In the future, if you have any questions, just ask directly. Don't beat around the bush." Although Huang Lin was reprimanding him, he still reminded him with concern, martial arts training techniques are very effective in raising the body's toughness. However, each practice will deplete one's potential. For each attribute from 10 to 19 points, every 10,000 potential points will increase one's attribute. For attributes from 20 to 29 points, every 20,000 potential points will increase one's attribute. From 30 points onwards, every 30,000 potential points will increase one's attribute. So on and so forth, as long as you use the training technique to stimulate and deplete enough potential points, you'll be able to increase one's attribute according to the training technique you're cultivating. However, if you train in a situation where your potential is insufficient, it will harm your body. When you're training, you must not deplete your potential. Your disciple understands. Does the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth cultivate strength? That's right. The other 9-headed dragon sword technique cultivates flexibility. Alright, you can leave first. Following this, Fang Xinjian naturally left the examination hall. He took the other passageway, not letting the other examinees see the entire process of the examination. He was guided by the staff to leave the Night Academy and head towards Curse City. However, halfway there, he could not help but start practicing the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth. This was the first time he was learning the training technique of sword art. He was too curious about the differences between training techniques and nurturing techniques, as well as the profoundness behind them. In fact, on the way out of the academy, he had already been itching to learn it. With the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth, with each slash, Fang Xinjian would take a step forward. With each step, the earth and atmosphere seemed to tremble a little, and his aura surged. After 16 steps, Fang Xinjian's aura surged and his muscles and bones trembled. He was like a god descending to the mortal world, and his entire person seemed to have swelled up. After exhaling lightly, Fang Xinjian stopped. Large amounts of perspiration seemed to be oozing out from every pore on his body, as if he had been in a sauna. Is this the training technique? Like the scorching heat of summer, tempering the body and stimulating one's potential. The cultivation of the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth is indeed extremely arduous. It feels like I've practiced the grizzly bear sword technique tens of times. Fang Xinjian only felt that in the process of practicing the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth, every muscle fiber in his body, especially his arms and back, seemed to be torn apart, undergoing an unprecedented training. Following this, Fang Xinjian continued on his way, practicing the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth. He soon discovered that each time he practiced the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth, it would deplete 10 potential points. When Fang Xinjian practiced it for the 12th time, the hegemonic chi/ of heavens and earth rose to level 2. When Fang Xinjian performed it again, each time he practiced it, he would deplete 20 potential points. Therefore, Fang Xinjian walked on the ground, swinging his sword and slashing, practicing the hegemonic qi slash of heavens and earth while rushing home. By the time he returned to the dilapidated house, the hegemonic qi slash of heavens and earth had already reached level 4. His clothes were drenched in sweat, and he looked like a cooked prawn, with a hint of redness in his eyes. It was obvious that the muscles and bones in his body were emitting a huge amount of heat like a furnace due to the intense training. However, he did not stop. Perhaps it was because the hegemonic qi slash of heavens and earth was a training technique, and it was the first time he had learned it. Perhaps it was because he had passed the prefectural selection and become a knight, or perhaps it was because he had become the disciple of the second transition expert Huang Lin, or perhaps it was because he was one step closer to his path of revenge. He felt that he was a little excited tonight. Feeling the sweat all over his body, he took off his clothes, revealing his strong muscles. Fang Xinjian continued practicing the hegemonic qi slash of heavens and earth. He practiced the entire night, going to the School of Sword Arts for breakfast before returning to continue practicing. By the afternoon, his hegemonic qi slash of heavens and earth had already reached level 6. Each time he practiced it, he would deplete 60 potential points. In total, he had depleted over 20,000 potential points. However, his current strength was 36 points, and he still needed to deplete less than 10,000 potential points to increase his strength by 1 point. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.